All right, we're going to begin the afternoon session with the Pacific Northwest. And our first speaker is Uma. And thank you very much. Uma, I forgot your last name here.
That's okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me? No. I'm just not talking into it. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So I was originally, my abstract is about tundra vegetation, and I'm going to only show one slide related to that because it's in my abstract. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about fairly raw ideas about Alaska climate variability that is related to the Pacific anomaly. So tundra is a maritime biome, and on the left, I'm showing you summer warmth. So it's how much warmth is available over the summer, and this is a trend over 32 years from 1982 onward. So most of the trends are positive, that generally it's been warming, and tundra plants, which are temperature limited, are more productive. On the right-hand panel, we see normalized difference vegetation index. And this is a satellite-based measure of vegetation productivity. And you can see it is positive just about everywhere except in southwestern Alaska, where something else is going on. And the time series below show that the temperatures have actually been relatively flat, that red line, over recent years, and the blue line shows North Pacific sea surface temperature. So we think that the rest of the tundra, which is more closely linked to Arctic sea ice and Arctic Ocean, in southwestern Alaska, something else is happening in the Pacific is important. And it's also not only correlated to temperatures in the Bering Sea, it's also correlated to the Blob. And in that when waters are warm off the coast in the Gulf of Alaska, there tends to be more summer warmth. And a preliminary analysis we did with a storm tracking algorithm shows that when that water's warm, there's actually fewer storms in the southern part of Alaska, and that would make it sunnier during springtime and help bring warmth. So that's all I'm going to say about the tundra. And I'll go on to the Pacific. So about a year ago in February of 2014, I gave a public talk, and we'd had a very warm winter in Alaska. So I started trying to give an explanation to the public about it. So the plot on the left shows temperature anomalies in the ocean from the ESRL webpage for November of 2013 until the end of January, 3 months. And it shows this warm water in the Gulf of Alaska as being probably one of the most prominent anomalies that we see. And if we look at 1 year later, essentially a similar type of anomaly, different scale, the water is still warm, as we're here talking about. The pattern's a little bit different over the 2 years. And I think related to what Rick Toman said this morning is there was a slight shift in the 500 millibar height pattern. So in January of 2014, we had an extreme, one of the top warmest winters in Alaska, Januaries, and on the right, that wasn't the case in this past year. So I'm going to just show some composites and give you some raw ideas of what we're thinking. So if we take the 5 warmest Januaries in the state of Alaska, these are based on analysis by Bryant Brenschneider, who has a climate blog called Alaska Info. So these are 5 years that were the warmest over the record from 48 onward. And we see that over Alaska, when it's warmer than normal, it's actually cooler than normal in the lower 48, and it's actually cooler than normal over Eurasia. And associated with the sea surface temperatures associated with the composites of those 5 Januaries, and you can expand the months, a few on either side, and the pattern looks similar, is this warm water in the North Pacific, and very much a very different a La Nina in the tropics and the positive phase of the PDO in the high latitude. So this plot really struck me as interesting, and it looked like the 30 OF that we saw earlier this morning. Now, simply if we have warm waters in the Gulf of Alaska, we tend to have a ridge pattern. This is showing wind speeds, and generally there's warm air from the south at 1,000 millibars, warm air advection during the wintertime, which keeps Alaska warm. And when we have this ridge, we have cold air coming from the north over the lower 48. And again, this pattern is, has been very much talked about, partially because it's been attributed to sea ice. And I'm wondering if not only is sea ice important, but maybe these temperatures in the Pacific are important. And then I was thinking about that, and I saw that there was a Lee et al. Paper actually discusses that. They've done some experiments where they show the role of sea ice as well as the warm waters in the northern Pacific to explain these warm anomalies in the high latitudes and cooler anomalies in the east coast of the US. Now, the next question is, what do the 5 coldest Januaries look like? And so I picked the 5 coldest Januaries, so it's, again, centered around Alaska. It's colder than normal throughout the Arctic, not such a strong anomaly in the Eurasian Arctic, and warmer than normal over the lower 48. And the sea surface temperature pattern looks like the negative phase of the PDO with these 5 cases. So again, all my analysis was looking at Alaska outward. So then what I thought with this workshop is to look at the sea surface temperatures in the North Pacific based on the Bond et al. Paper, and this is the time series from 48 onwards. And if we look at, pick some warm cases, and actually the 2005 case got missed there, and the cold cases, and look at composites based on that, because one of the things with the Alaska case is that perhaps some of the anomalies are due to the fact that I have fairly few cases. So the patterns, the sea surface temperature pattern composites look fairly similar. Again, there's also, in this case, there's not that much going on in the eastern equatorial tropics, and the surface air temperature anomalies on the right, again, show warmer than normal in the Bering Sea region and along the west coast off the west coast of North America, and cooler than normal in the east coast. Again, it looks similar, but it's a little bit shifted. So, so my final comments, again, I'll summarize here, take some time here. You know, could North Pacific circulation explain why Southwest Alaska tundra vegetation productivity has been declining? Because a lot of what we've looked at is we've looked at it more from the Arctic point of view, and it may be what's going on farther south is more important. So that's probably my primary research interest. In terms of Alaska winter climate anomalies, we see that anomalously warm Alaska Januaries tend to occur when eastern US is cooler than normal, and the ocean temperatures also tend to be warmer than normal south of Alaska during these extreme warm winters. And again, that might be important when we look at the changes in the polar vortex. It may not just be sea ice, it may also be the ocean temperatures that are playing a role, and I see people are working on that. The anomalously cold Alaska Januaries have opposite surface air temperature and SST anomaly patterns to the warm case. And equatorial Pacific was cooler than normal for both the warm and the cold Alaska Januaries, which has struck me as potentially interesting. Is it too few cases, or is it something real? And the composites based on the Pacific SST, if we start with the Pacific SST, look similar to the Alaska composites, but not quite. There's some differences. So again, I probably raised more questions than answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. Next, we have Peter Bianchi from University of Alaska, Fairbanks.
I'm going to take a little step back here and take a look a little bit at some of the historical look at this, maybe a little bit, focused on Alaska. And we're also going to take a look at some of the mechanism for relating SSTs in the North Pacific to temperatures over the terrestrial side in Alaska as well in the springtime. I want to thank also my colleagues Uma and Rick Toman for collaborating as well with this talk. So let's take a look here. This is a time series of the temperature for 13 climate divisions throughout Alaska, and this is annual temperatures. These have been smoothed, and you can see all 13, and the PDO is also smoothed and superimposed over the top here. So you can see that there's a lot of correlation, pretty strong correlation. Basically, when the PDO is positive in phase, we tend to have positive or warmer than normal temperatures over Alaska, or we have cooler than normal temperatures over Alaska during the negative PDO phase. And again, this goes back to 1920. So we've got a pretty strong positive correlation in a smoothed sense. Now keep in mind that this PDO time series and all of these have been adjusted, their means, so that you'll see a lot of negatives here. But so basically this just gives you an idea of how things have been tracing over the last century or so. And you can see this time series in particular ends in 2012. So you don't see this, you see that there's been a, you know, in the 2012s it looked like things were going to go negative in the PDO, but obviously, you know, things have changed perhaps with this warm blob. And we'll take a look at that also toward the end of this. So one of the things that we've been interested in Alaska is trying to link these, you know, Pacific SSTs, because we know things like the PDO and ENSO have strong correlations with what's going on. So we've been looking at investigating these different mechanisms. And river ice breakup date, which is an interesting phenomenon that happens every spring. Basically, you know, we have frozen rivers up in Alaska, and then we'll have this thaw cycle at the end. And then there's that timing of when the river ice actually breaks up and starts moving. And that's something that's been recorded since basically over the last century. And it's a very interesting time series to study. And it turns out it's strongly linked to climate. So basically, breakup date, it's a somewhat arbitrary definition, but it's recorded within NOAA, within the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center office. And basically, we took a look at some statistics, and we found that it's actually interrelated across Alaska, and that there's, not only is it interrelated, and this gives you a look at the time series of that since the 1950s, but we also see low frequency variability within that over Alaska's major rivers, which is basically integrated here in this one time series. So basically about a 10 to 11 year cycle is happening within this. We also see PDO variability in here somewhat as well, when it's smoothed and when it's correlated as well. But it's mostly correlated also with ENSO as a precursor. And there's also this trend to earlier breakup date. It's about a day, day and a half per decade going back since the 1950s to present. And this is a very interesting, that shows our linkage between our breakup date and SSTs and surface air temperatures. So basically, these two plots are regressions of the breakup date, that time series for Alaska, on SSTs and on surface air temperatures. And it's shaded, showing you where it's statistically significant. So red for positive, blue for negative. So basically, when you see this red over Alaska, that means that when it's warmer in spring, April, May, you have earlier breakup date. And that can also indicate if you're gonna have more severe breakup or if you're gonna have flooding as well, earlier breakup, later breakup. And then you can see, if you go back to a one season lead on that, you can see also similar pattern, this kind of PDO ENSO-like pattern over the Pacific. So here you can see that there's definitely a coupling that's going on between these two things. And I'll present here in a second our mechanism for that. So basically, we used a storm tracking algorithm. This is by Zhang et al. That was developed for the Arctic. And this is just a look at what, you know, we track individual storms tracking into the Gulf of Alaska. And then we looked, and it turned out when we did a lot of statistics in April, May, that we had pretty strong linkage between, if we got less storms, we tended to get warmer temperatures over Alaska. And that was something that Uma just alluded to a second ago. And basically what we found when we pulled all of that together, and we did a lot of statistics, we basically found that during El Nino or ENSO, or I guess PDO type conditions, we tend to get a reduction in storms tracking into the southern part of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska. And that actually feeds back to a reduction in cloudiness during the springtime in the April-May time period. And then that further goes on and results in more solar insolation, more surface heating, and that actually is what drives an earlier breakup date. And then the converse is true. If you get more storms, you get more cloudiness and a reduction in breakup date. And we also found, I mean, there's a connection, of course, to precipitation over the winter as well. So there's a few interesting components. But this is a actual mechanism that will link SSTs over the Pacific to something happening over land in a place like Alaska. So if we take a look recently over the last, this is another breakup date data set, and these lines that you see here are the means and standard deviations. You can see that, you know, this is for one breakup date site in Inanna that goes all the way back to 1920. And you can see even here there's the downward shift when it got warmer with the PDO since the 1980s here. But you can take a look at these most recent 2 years. Those are 2014, 2015. And we have been having earlier breakup dates in these last 2 years. They're not record early, but they've been earlier, definitely earlier than the standard deviation. And that standard deviation is about a week or so. So basically these just happened a couple weeks ago. And we have a few earlier peaks down here as well in the earlier 2000s. I don't necessarily know if these corresponds per se to the blob or anything like it. But now if we take a look at, so as I was just saying, we were talking about storm tracks in the Gulf of Alaska. So this is just basically, and this is my last slide, but basically a storm density, a storm track density. We took the storm tracks from that storm tracking algorithm, and then we count them for each grid point, the number that passed over that. And then this is an anomaly relative to the 1981-2000 mean of storms. So you can see that, you know, here we have the Gulf of Alaska, and this is our important collection point in spring. And we have had, in this particular 1 year, we had a slight reduction of storms up to about 4. But as you can see, it's a somewhat noisy data set. So, but I think it's worth exploring with time and seeing, you know, what other information we can get out of this with storm tracks. And that's definitely consistent with, as Uma and Rick and others have said about if we get ridging that's enhanced in this area, that we'll get a reduction in storms here as well. So, but yeah, the take-home message from my talk definitely is that, you know, we have strong linkages with what's going on over the SSTs in the Pacific to what's going on terrestrially in Alaska. And it's definitely worth exploring, well, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Next, we have Chris Hullerai with NOAA from Alaska.
Thanks, Julie. And I can hear the echo, too. So I'll start, while it's coming up, just saying I'm Chris Hullerai, and I'm with the NOAA Kazitsneve Lab, so part of the Coastal Ocean Science Office, part of the Ocean Service, part of NOAA. But I'm actually talking about work from a whole group of people here, that are working within the Gulf Watch Alaska program now. So it's a long-term ecosystem monitoring program funded by the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council for the past several years. It's also data that's been collected over 40-plus years in the Gulf. So we're going to go through a lot of stuff fairly quickly. And I've got a poster later with some of the time series for further discussion. But I want to acknowledge the funding for this work, both by the Alaska Ocean Observing System as well as the EVOS Trustee Council. So just to orient where we're going to be talking, we're going to zoom in on that circle up in south central Alaska, so the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska for this work. And to orient now in there, so in the upper left-hand side, the black shows the effect of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, so that's where we're sampling in that region for this program. And we've got a coordinated study between work that's being done on the shelf, so the green line there going from Resurrection Bay out to the slope along the Seward line, plus work being done in the Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet estuaries. For size reference, Cook Inlet is about twice the length of Puget Sound. It's about the same size as Chesapeake Bay. And this system is connected from the Pacific Northwest, actually all the way up through here by the Alaska Coastal Current. And there's very strong connections within, between the estuaries and along the shelf here that you'll see in some of the data. Some of the influences around here that matter a lot is we get a lot of freshwater input from rain, from precip, from snowpack melt, from glacier melt here, affected by the mountains, affected by routine but not consistent shelf-ocean exchange. So all of that is playing a role in what we're looking at and why we're monitoring in these different places. So the colors show you where we're monitoring. We'll zoom in on a couple of that in a minute, but just to give you a sense, so our coastal mountain ranges here are generally in the 3,000 to 5,000 foot range, and we've got ice fields and glaciers there, so a little bit different. A lot of sediment and freshwater input all along this coast, and within Cook Inlet, we've got tidal ranges between about 8.5 and 9 meters. So it's an interesting place to do work. So this is where we're actually doing the sampling in the oceanographic and plankton side of our program. We go all the way up to nearshore and whales and species in the full range of the program, but I'm going to focus on this part. And I'm going to show you a subset here of data from 3 different places. One is along the Seward line, so that's along that green line there. One is from central Prince William Sound, and then some work from Kachemak Bay in lower Cook Inlet. So starting with kind of to orient to the longer time series here. So this is temperature and salinity data. So on the left-hand side, we've got temperature data first integrated over 0 to 100 meters and then a little bit deeper. And then on the right, salinity in those same depths. This is from the GAC 1 mooring, the Gulf of Alaska 1 mooring, which is off of Resurrection Bay near Seward. And this is a time series from 1970 to 2014. And just to take a look at a couple of the things here, you know, one is, where am I? Nope, I just did the wrong thing. Okay, so one is that we can see the recent warming in the surface and subsurface temperatures, but also want to put it in the context of the longer warming trend, both surface and subsurface, which does include the very strong regime shift period of the 1976 to 77 transition. Also note that there is a long-term trend of freshening, decreasing of salinity at the surface, increasing slightly at the subsurface. So just to kind of put the recent warming in that context. And now jumping to along the Seward line, so this is extending from that same mooring, and I keep losing the, there we go. So the GAC 1 mooring is on this side, which is the coast side, and this is extending offshore to the slope measurements. The left values are temperature at top, salinity at the bottom for 2013 September, and then temperature salinity for 2014. And this is just to show you the sharpness of the transition between these 2 years, because 2013 was cool and salty relative to the average from 98 to present. And then 2014, a big increase, saw increases of 2 to 4 degrees C in the surface layers, as well as some freshening in the salinity. But just to see that the structure was pretty pronounced across the shelf. And then putting that in a little bit longer context. So here now, these are the anomalies from 2013 and 2014, September in both cases. Again, we're looking at from the coast offshore here with temperature on the left and salinity on the right. And you can see we had a cooler, in this case, saltier period in September of 2013, and this was the warm-up and freshening that happened in 2014. So just kind of get the scale of that. But a couple of pieces, one is that, again, we've got this long-term warming trend, but the recent warm-up follows a pretty distinct cooling period from 2006 to 2012, and that sharp transition, I think that's going to be, I would like to see discussed later, because I think there's a lot of implications for the sharpness of that transition. We had particularly saw that along the Seward line, with warming and freshening in 2014. And then the magnitude of these events were similar to what's been observed in the 76 to 77 transition, the 97 to 98 El Nino, and the 2005 events. One of the things here with both warming and freshening at the surface, we are increasing the water stability, which has implications for nutrient resupply, which is very important here. That's driving our productivity. So that's some discussions about what this might mean for production. So now I'm going to shift into coming west to Kachemak Bay and Cook Inlet, so going into the estuaries. This is now a time series from a coastal station at Seldovia from 2004 to current. And it's just to put in context, the 2014 warming, which got us up to about 12 degrees C, had not been seen since that 2005 event. So it was about equivalent to what we saw there. Also wanted to note that our winter temperatures, like you saw earlier, were quite warm. 4 degrees C for us in winter temperatures is really, really quite warm. Again, relative to what we'd seen back in 2005, 2006. And then those were temperatures, kind of to give you a feel for what our actual temperatures are in the northern Gulf. These are now anomalies from that same station. And this is just showing you something you've seen a little bit from what Rick and others showed earlier about all of 2014 was pretty warm for us. So we were anomalously, we're in about a ½ degree to 1.5 degrees C above the 11-year mean. Again, in the context of we had a pretty good cooling period in the about 6 years prior to that. And so there's some questions about how does the estuary temperatures relate to the shelf? Are these things moving together or not? I used the warm year of 2005, which was followed by a cool year of 2006 to show you the difference between these. So the blue is the GAC-1 mooring. That's that mooring off of Resurrection Bay. And then the red is the Seldovia. And you can see basically the tracking over seasonal and annual time frames with differences in between. If you do the coherence between those, you see that it becomes coherent at about a 3-month time period. So for shorter periods, it's not, but longer than that, it is. And there we go. And then jumping to now to Prince William Sound. So these are, it's a compiled series of CTD-casts, so data from CTD-casts that Rob Campbell with the Prince William Sound Science Center has put together. Again, these are anomalies taken in the central, from cast in the central sound, and then surface measurements at the top and down to 200 meters here. Just pulling out a couple of things here. Again, you can see the 2014 warming was through the water column, and point out just for to relate the magnitude of the shift from in the 76-77 transition, which was another cool to warm shift back here. Again, one that was through the water column. And so just to kind of recap on here, one of the things we've seen both in the recent event and as a long-term trend is this warming of surface waters, the freshening of surface waters, which you would expect with an increase of freshwater discharge associated with warming and more snowpack melt and glacier melt and things like that, and then the implications that has for water column stability. So I'm going to make a shift from the oceanography here to show you some of the results that we have from some of the zooplankton measurements. I'm going to just look at two. We're also collecting zooplankton in Prince William Sound and Lower Cook Inlet, but I'm going to show you the results from the Seward line and from the continuous plankton recorder measurements that are being made on a transect going from Anchorage over to Puget Sound. So this is Russ Hopcroft's work. And so from the Seward line, this is time series from 1998 to present. And this is just 4 of the southern copepod species, and sort of that they really are showing up in this 2013-2014 period, with the last time that we saw them was in, about that 2005 warm-up event. So interesting results. They're not a big part of the population of the biomass, but definitely seeing the highest populations of them this past year. And he's out there sampling this week, or he would be here. So we'll find out shortly what we're finding this year. This is Sonia Batten's work. So this is from the continuous plankton recorder measurements. And these are pretty interesting. So to orient you to what you're looking at, this is a 2000 to 2014 time series. The dark line is the long-term monthly mean. The lighter lines show you the minimum and the maximum over the time frame to 2013 that's been seen, and then the dots, the circles, are the 2014 measurements. And everything is final data except for the provisional data shown with the open circle. And so what you'll see here first in the diatoms, so the diatoms for 2014 were fairly, the ones that the CPR collects are fairly large, or only the large cells, and these, it was low abundant diatoms, which is indicative of, which would be consistent with warmer water. Zooplankton abundance was fairly normal in the spring, but off the chart in the summer. And zooplankton biomass was also high, not quite as off the chart as abundance, but also high. It made the annual anomaly be one of the highest. It's not the highest of the record, but one of the highest of this 14-year record. And then the copepods were relatively small, which was also indicative of typical for warm water conditions. So that's quick run through of a lot of different results. What I want to make a plug for is that this is part of a monitoring program that provides data. Our goal is to provide data for these kinds of uses and others, and we have what I think is a really great website and data portal, and those are the links to get there, and I'd encourage everyone to check out the data on there and see if it helps in answering some of the questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Hamal Mas is up next from NOAA Fisheries. We appreciate all these Alaska people, because when I first mentioned the date to Molly, she goes, oh no, everybody's going to be out on the cruise and we aren't going to have anybody here. So I'm really glad, because you did well. You got a good showing from Alaska.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to take this opportunity to share some slides that we pulled together for a leadership briefing that happened just last month on observations that we saw out in the field. So I'm from the Auk Bay Lab, which is a division of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And we have the good fortune of having a number of fisheries oceanographic surveys, as well as just fisheries surveys that are out on the water every year. And this gives us a great opportunity to capture interannual variability. And here we go. So we've seen this picture a bunch today. This is just the warm blob. This is what it looked like in September, just after the period of time when most of these surveys that I'll share this information with you occurred. Just wanted to say a couple things about the Gulf of Alaska as an ecosystem as a whole, its physical properties. The Gulf is a downwelling system. During periods of relaxed downwelling and high winds, we get shots of production. The Alaska coastal current is a prominent feature that's on the shelf. In the east, it's kind of weak and meandering. Once we get to the west, it becomes very strong and well-defined. And as we know, the Alaska terrestrial environment is very warm, the warmest on record. There's also been warming in inside waters. I've got a little bit of data from Icy Strait that shows us coming into another period of warming. And in Southeast Alaska, where I'm from, what we've noticed is higher than normal rainfall, not much snow at all, and a pretty mild winter. So the Climate Prediction Center is predicting a 75% chance that we'll have anomalously warm conditions in Alaska, which is very high. And that's for this coming spring and summer. Last year in 2014, the terrestrial climate was very warm as well, the warmest on record for the past 66 years. One thing that I wanted to mention here was that the high Arctic tends to get a lot of the PR when it comes to significant implications of global warming and climate change. But the Pacific Rim is also very sensitive, and we've got sentinel species such as salmon, which do not do well typically in warm conditions and in low stream flows. So we could see some pretty big implications for the people that live in this region there. In Icy Strait, we've been out there since 1997, and this is a figure that shows the upper 20 meters of the integrated water column. And you can see in 2014, looks like we're starting to come into another period of warming. The first survey I'd like to talk about is the Southeast Alaska Coastal Monitoring Survey. The survey has gone on for about 17 years. Typically, it occurs from May to August. They used to do some September sampling as well. And the Southeast Coastal Monitoring is primarily a survey that looks at juvenile pink salmon. They do a great job of forecasting juvenile pink salmon because most of the mortality from these fish have occurred before they reach Icy Strait. So our CPUEs there typically reflect what returns will be. The other survey I'll talk a little bit about is the Gulf of Alaska Assessment. This survey was designed primarily to provide leading indicators for groundfish recruitment, looking at the age 0, that juvenile life stage, as well as focus on juvenile salmon ecology. And these are the survey stations we sampled last year, basically from Cape Omni, the bottom of Baranof Island, up to Yakutat Sound, Yakutat Bay. So in both surveys, we use a pelagic rope trawl that's rigged to fish at the surface. We do oceanography at each of those stations by deploying a CTD. We collect information on the nutrients and chlorophyll to kind of come up with estimates of production for phytoplankton. We also tow a bongo in order to get a sense for what zooplanktons are out there, as well as ichthyoplankton. Chris just talked a little bit about this program. The Prince William Sound research effort that we have going is a partnership between NOAA and Gulf Watch Alaska. And our part of this survey is mostly focused on looking at whales and herring. So what did we see? In Prince William Sound in 2014, we found a high abundance of juvenile herring that were very fat and very large. And typically when we have juvenile fish that are very fat, very large, and very abundant, that's a good indicator that we're gonna have a nice age class coming in. However, that's not the case. We lost track of these fish in our winter and spring sampling that our lab does, the folks at the Prince William Sound Science Center that also do acoustic surveys have not been able to track them. So this is kind of an enigma. Something happened to these fish over the winter. We believe it has something to do with the blob. Not just in Prince William Sound, but also in the Gulf proper. We've seen a decrease in herring. Unexpectedly, the Sitka Sound herring fishery, which is a seminal fishery for herring in our state, came in really low. One thing that we did find that was very interesting is that we had a high energetic condition of zooplankton. Chris just mentioned that zooplankton abundance was off the chart last year, which is very interesting. Also that there were a number of large diatoms, which is good for the bigger macrozooplankton. But we had significantly higher energetic condition of zooplankton in 2014 relative to 2013. And this energy would then be transferred directly to those fish, especially those juvenile fish that prey upon these animals. We also happen to see the largest juvenile pink salmon inhabiting Icy Strait over the period of time that we've been sampling. So these are really big fish. And out in the Gulf proper, from samples from the GOA assessment, these pink salmon had the highest energetic condition since we've been monitoring that in 2010. So all these signs indicate that these fish are going to do well. And so the preseason forecast that comes out of our lab is actually forecasting a good year, a good return for these fish, despite the presence of the blob. And pink salmon life history, I shouldn't take that for granted. They're only out there for a year. So these fish that we sampled last year are going to be returning back to the streams to spawn this year. As far as effects on groundfish populations, we don't really know. It's too young to tell what kind of effects the blob will have. We did, in 2014, encounter a huge amount of age 0 sablefish. Sablefish have very episodic recruitment events. So I'll just pull a number somewhere between every 9 and 16 years, say, we might get a really big sablefish recruitment event. This may or may not have something to do with the warm blob, but needless to say, we're very interested in taking a closer look at that. So out in the Gulf proper, we noticed a lot of what I would call warm water pelagic species moving up north and onto the shelf, such as pomfret. We occasionally catch pomfret when we're way offshore at our stations that are like 100 miles out. But these fish were all over the place. They were up in the shelf, and they were feeding on numerous age 0 marine fish. We also, for the first time, captured Pacific sunfish in our surveys. And last year, we documented the furthest north thresher shark on record. So in summary, the warm blob appears advantageous for some species, such as pink salmon. They were big, they were fat, they should have good return rates. Zooplankton had significantly higher energy content, so that warrants a closer look to understand the biophysical processes that might have set conditions up for that. Juvenile age class of herring were there in the summer and fall. Something happened to them over the winter. Right now, that's still an unknown. It could be potentially predators, but I'm not sure. The effect on groundfish stocks is still relatively unknown. And then we also had these northern range extensions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamo. And Peter Chandler, our Canadian representative from the Fisheries. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. My name is Peter Chandler. I'm a physical oceanographer with the Fisheries and Oceans Canada at the Institute of Ocean Sciences on Vancouver Island. And this talk is actually a combination of work that's been done by myself, Marie Robert, who is the coordinator of the Line P surveys, and Moira Galbraith, who's a zooplankton specialist. This picture up here is because part of the information, or part of the data set, is actually very near shore. It's being collected by lighthouses, so it runs the gamut of near shore to offshore. And just to let you know that this event, the Blob, also played in Canada, and it played in 3 different theaters that we can see. The lighthouse stations are, the ones that I've chosen are from Langara, which is at the northern tip of Haida Gwaii, down through the coast into the Strait of Georgia, which is entrance in Chrome. There's also a set of Environment Canada wave buoys, which also have sea surface temperature sensors on them. So they'll be looking at those as well. And the third data set I'm looking at is the Line P data, which is a survey that goes out. It's a vessel survey, goes out 3 times a year, February, June, August, September. And that gives that third dimension to what we're seeing in the temperatures. So just to confirm that we cross-compare these data sets, the shore stations actually go back some of them, decades, with a very simple sampling process, which is really throwing a bucket in the water at the daylight high tide and measuring the temperature. It used to be just done with a glass thermometer. Now we've got a handheld meter, but the resolution is still between about 0.2 degrees centigrade. The weather buoys have been out for about just over 20 years now, most of them, and they have a sensor that measures hourly or provide hourly measurements, and they have a similar type of temperature accuracy. So what we see, this is looking at the Lighthouse Station mean annual temperature of 2013 compared to 2014. And it's pretty obvious that they've all observed an increase in the mean annual temperature. Except for you can see on the right-hand side, Benilla, and I'll talk about that. That's in the Hecate Strait between one of the northern major island off British Columbia, which is Haida Gwaii, and the mainland. And the reason that we'll notice it in the wave data as well. So this is a mean annual increase. This is the climatology from 1981 to 2010, a 30-year climatology. It's a standard climatology. And I think what's evident in this is that most stations are in excess of the climatology, the 30-year climatology. And if we add on top of that the all-time average, we can see that we're experiencing warm conditions in 2014. 2013 was warm as well, but 2014 is really doing that much better in terms of if you're rooting for sea surface temperature. The weather buoys, this is the same information for the weather buoys. We see the same general pattern. This is generally going, so the point is that the temperatures are warmer, so we see that now we see two data sets showing the same thing. The all-time data, because it doesn't go back as far, it doesn't have the climatology, so I'm just using the all-time data, it is still higher than what's been observed since this monitoring system went in. Now I'm going to show a series of these plots because this is how I'm representing the anomalies. And you notice along the bottom, it goes from January of 2014 up to pretty much the present. The curved line is the mean annual sea surface temperature for that day of the year. And the dashed lines are the standard deviations. So that's from the entire data record. The blue indicates temperatures on this particular time frame that are below that average, and the red show what's above the average. So this is the positive anomaly in red, the negative anomaly in blue. The scattered dark black points above and below the line are the all-time records in the data set. So what we're seeing typically, and this is Kane's Lighthouse, which is on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, is what we can see is that generally negative anomalies up until April or May of last year, and then started to get some pretty significant positive anomalies. As we move through the year, or into 2015, we can see a very consistent positive anomaly, and in many cases exceeding the all-time records. Now, one of the interesting things about Kane's Lighthouse is that the May-June sea surface temperatures are used as part of a formula to predict the diversion of salmon coming back to the Fraser River, whether they go through around northern Vancouver Island or southern Vancouver Island. And this last year's sea surface temperatures kind of blew that formula all to pieces, because the May temperatures were so high compared to the June, there's a bit of negative anomalies in June, that it became very difficult to use the standard formula to predict that diversion. So anyway, I'm going to go now through a couple of different places on the coast, and this is the Lighthouse data. So this is Amphitrite. We see it starting a little bit sooner. There's a bit of a cooler period, but if you look on the right-hand side of the plot, it's starting to get consistently warm. This is Benilla. Now this is the one that's in Hecate Strait between Haida Gwaii and the mainland, and what we can see is the reason the mean annual temperature went down was because the first part of the year actually stayed cooler for a longer period of time. But since September, it has now picked up the pattern and has very positive anomalies. Langare is at the top, and it's kind of an amalgam in between them. But once again, we're seeing, this is just missing data here from January of last year, but we do see a consistent pattern developing. And these are the very coastal stations. This is right off the rocks. And Chrome Lighthouse, which is actually in the Strait of Georgia, doesn't show as significant a pattern. You know, it's not actually hitting temperatures on the right-hand side. But it's in the Strait of Georgia, and we believe there's going to be some delayed effect from what's going on. It does usually reflect the influence of what's going on in the Pacific Ocean, but with a bit of a delay. So this is the first wave buoy I want to show you, and this is the one up in North Hecate Strait, and we can see that the wave buoy and the lighthouse is representing similar environmental conditions. This is one that is off South Brooks, and we can see that we had a very cold, a significantly cold first part of last year. The conditions now are considerably different. And this is one further up the coast showing a similar pattern. This is just offshore. The reason I show this one, this is our furthest offshore buoy, and we can see this actually goes back 18 months, and it didn't have that cooling period at the beginning of January of last year. So it has been actually warm for quite a bit longer. This is the line P data. So we get that third dimension that Francisco was talking about, and we can see here that this is the cruise that went out in February, or last February 2015. And we can see that surface band of very high or positive anomaly water. The right-hand side is the coast, and this is out by 145 at Station Papa. This is a comparison of what we saw last year. And what I want to point out is, you can see, maybe you can't. Yes. No. On the right-hand side of last year, it's actually quite cool near the coast compared to this year. And but it still has a warmer surface. Not much going on below 100 meters, not a lot of difference. So if we look at the three cruises from last year, 1, 2, 3, and then the one from just a couple of months ago, we can see that there is a consistent positive anomaly in sea surface temperatures in the top 100 meters. And that there is a difference between February of last year and February of this year. February of this year indicating A, you don't have that surface cooling band, and B, it's actually quite a bit warmer. The anomaly is quite a bit more positive. So that's the temperature. I also want to take a look at the density anomaly, because this is what was referred to earlier in some talks about that capping and that stratification in the upper layer. And we can see that as it goes through the year, the summer is typically more stratified, less wind activity, but it's also in our February 2015 survey, it's that same sense of a surface cap, which is likely going to then provide either a barrier to mixing down or perhaps a cap with the upwelling not breaking through. So I also wanted to, as other people have done, added a bit onto our zooplankton monitoring. And this is done by Moira in a different group. And I'm hoping that it is the same protocol that other people are using, because I think it's a fairly standard protocol. But I'm just going to talk about the two areas. NVI is Northern Vancouver Island, and SVI is Southern Vancouver Island. And the way that our group actually looks at this information is we tend to get composite of species and identify them. You know, we could have, so there's 5 species in the southern copepod group, and other species in the boreal shelf copepods and subarctic oceanic copepods. And that by having a collection of species, then we start saying, okay, this is how these southern copepods work. And typically you can see in the top left there, you know, in some of the warmer years, you can see a negative anomaly, and the pattern starts to develop. And I'm not going to go on too much about that. It's just that because in this year, in our 2014 survey, before I get to that, is that what we found was that in the first part of the year, there was quite a few what we would consider northern copepods and a less proportion of the southern copepods, and that changed over the year. So that'll come into later in the discussion. But the discussion items are essentially that the temperatures out there are warmer, except for the south of Georgia, which we expect, which we're monitoring very carefully to see how that will change. and that the wave buoy data is consistent with what we've seen at the lighthouse as well. So it's gone right up to the coast. Further offshore, we see these positive SST anomalies for a longer period of time. The line P data shows what was a positive SST is still there. It's probably even more positive in our latest survey. And there also is continuing work done with that potential, that stratification, the other physical properties of line P data. All right, so this is what I was getting back to about the zooplankton, is that, so these northern copepods, or northern species, are considered much more energy rich. And so for the first half of 2014, we felt that, or it was observed that because of the presence of these organisms, that plankton feeding seabirds, which we saw earlier, had good fledgling success. But as the temperatures rose and the availability of the nutritious zooplankton declined and replaced by the southern copepods, perhaps that was coincident with these mass mortalities. And the third point is these record high diversion rate of Fraser River going over the northern of Vancouver Island rather than south, which is a big deal if you're a fisherman from Washington State, because they don't come close. And that of course is what's being looked at very carefully this year as well. That's just the summary. I've said that. And I would like to thank the other contributors from the Institute of Ocean Sciences and Ian Perry, who co-chaired the State of the Ocean report earlier this year, which actually addressed many of these issues. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Next, we have Jan Newton, Nanus, and University of Washington.
Nicely done. Okay. All right. All right, thank you. So, similar yet different. So we're continuing down the coast to Nanus region, which is Washington and Oregon. I'm going to talk about Washington, and I want to acknowledge the co-authors here. And what I want to present are some observations that take us over time and as well as over depth. So one of the great things that the wizards that comprise our Nanus data management and user products team developed was this great app called the Climatology app. And if you go to our Data Explorer, you'll see that you can access that. And so what is this Climatology app? Well, it is an app that allows you to visualize several things. One is for the NDBC buoys and the Seaman buoys. If you click on those, you can see maps of climatology and anomalies. And so I'll show you a couple as an example. So the one known as Washington and the one known as Tillamook. All right, so here's the plot that you see, and kudos to Jonathan Allen for putting these together. So similar to what we've been seeing, all of the data is in gray. Note that this is a 39-year record. The blue is the seasonal trend. The pink on either side is ±1 standard deviation, and the red is +2 standard deviations. The black is the 2015 data that have been smoothed, and the turquoise is 2015 raw data. So what's really amazing is that this is, for a 39-year record, this is clearly way over 2 standard deviations from the mean. And the other thing that I find really impressive is how flat that temperature record is in the early part of 2015 at about 12 degrees Celsius. So, you know, and it's like now it's hitting the line. It's like, oh, it's only 2 standard deviations. Okay, now moving inshore to Tillamook off of Oregon, you see a similar pattern, yet it is, there's a couple of differences. One is that now we're below 2 standard deviations. And there's a tilt to this. So there's a strong difference in terms of where we started the year. It was cooler towards the coast, probably, you know, mixing and periodic upwelling in between the downwelling. All right, so to summarize, the blob, if you look through the data, which I've done a lot, it's hotter offshore. Off the Pacific Northwest, it didn't cool over winter. We didn't see the seasonal dip. It's still around 2 standard deviations above the mean, depending on where you are. And there's a strong difference between the dynamics offshore and onshore. Not surprising, because the next thing I want to show you is another feature of this climatology app done by Craig Rissian, who's in our audience, is satellite anomalies. This happens to be the NCDC optimal interpolation. I had to bring my cheat sheet. Sea surface temperature anomaly, and this happens to be for August 2014. So while the rest of the Pacific was having this strong warm blob up against our coast, upwelling was making it actually, by the blue color, cooler than average. And so we had strong upwelling centers, as you see, and the blob was kept at bay. But then what happens is the shift from upwelling to downwelling. Shown here are the data for October 2014, and you see that that warm anomaly goes all the way to the coastline, right snug up against the coastline. All right, but so far everything I've shown you is from the surface only. So let's look under the surface with depth. And to do that, we'll look at data from the buoy that's shown by that red star. It's Cheba, which means whale tail in Quileute. There's Cheba, which is shown there on this schematic. There's also a profiler that goes within 20 meters of the surface. But for temperature, we had several probes up and down the line on the Cheba buoy. So we have really excellent depth resolution on this system. So now let's look at this seasonal wind shift from predominantly upwelling winds to predominantly downwelling winds, and you can see that it happened right before October starts. And so these are winds from the buoy, actually from the buoy. Here's the money slide. All right, so what we have here is depth on this axis from somewhere around 5 meters to over 80 meters. And then this is July through October, and we're plotting temperature. Sorry, it got cut off. That is in degrees Celsius from 7 to 17. And that blue line denotes basically when we had the shift from upwelling dominant winds to downwelling dominant winds. And we see just this incredible temperature signal of basically the blob moving onshore. And not only moving onshore, but really there's strong depth definition to this. So that first wind pulse brought it down to about 30 meters, and then the second wind pulse brought it down to about 60 meters or so. Sadly, we had to take the buoy out of the water for maintenance, which is driving us crazy, but we're really happy now to have gotten funding through NOAA's OAP to have another buoy, so we'll have full year coverage next year. So anyways, I think this is really important observation, because if you compare the temperature between 20 and 40 meters in 2014 compared to our record, which admittedly is not very long, 4 years long, it's 6 degrees Celsius degrees warmer than it was in those other years. So imagine you're a fish living between 20 and 40 meters. You've got quite a signal to contend with. All right, so a dramatic fall transition from upwelling to downwelling brought the blob feature onshore, and also warm waters penetrate quite deep. All right, but Washington State has a lot of inland waters, so what about the inland waters? Let's look at that. And so here's a satellite view. The S is just south of the San Juan Archipelago. I actually teach a class out of Friday Harbor Laboratories, and I encourage any students to take that class. It's a research apprenticeship. We've been doing this for over 10 years, and it's on the pelagic ecosystem from the water molecule to whale, as we call it. And so that's our southern station. And so here is a TS plot of the data for the first week of November for all of the years starting in 2004. They're color-coded by their El Nino forcing, so blue being La Nina, red being El Nino, and you can see there's this really cool pattern. But what about 2014? I had to put a circle around it so you wouldn't think it was a splotch or a dead bug. So that was pretty compelling to us. It was a lot, couple degrees higher, but not only was it so much warmer than anything we had seen, it actually had warmer waters at depth, which makes sense when you think of estuarine inflow. But here is now showing for these cruises with time the temperature, and you can clearly see that the deep, we integrated the bottom 10 meters and the top 10 meters. The bottom in orange is warmer than the surface waters. So that's a pretty interesting signal to be able to record. And we always see the fall transition, but this time we really saw a pattern that was profoundly different than anything we'd seen before. All right, so what about the rest of Puget Sound? So now the T is there in Puget Sound in actually a offside basin called Hood Canal. Tuano is the name, and there's a buoy there that Al Duvall, who's in the audience, and I and John Mickett, co-author, have had out there for a lot of years. And so what went on in Hood Canal? I can say that in November, we have a buoy that's kind of up at the entrance to Puget Sound. That had a temperature anomaly about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than average in November. But as you come into Puget Sound, all sorts of mixing happens, and there's differences between the basins. But let's look at what we saw at Tuano. And so here are some anomaly plots. The top one is density, or sigma T. Largely it reflects salinity, and we can talk about temperature in Hood Canal, but there's kind of a funny thing that went on there. The bottom one is oxygen. What's notable is that I want to draw your attention to the end of the year, November, December. We had much lighter, less dense waters than normal. And if you look, we go from having high oxygen to less oxygen. Normally, Hood Canal gets flushed right around September, October, and that's because of the dense seawater that's been upwelling off the coast, comes into Puget Sound, it flushes out the old water in Hood Canal, which can become hypoxic. And we think that that actually didn't happen this year, that the waters were just not dense enough to actually make that final push up into Lynch Cove of Hood Canal. So we have hypoxic waters there now. We've had them since basically the end of the year, November, December. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. It could be a really bad year for hypoxia because we're starting so low. On the other hand, it could be not an issue if we do have some dense waters that come in, because it's going to be pretty easy to displace that water because it's lighter than typical. All right, so there's a little bit of a summary of this inland water discourse. So where are we going now? and I also wanted to show off a little bit more of Craig's anomaly patterns. And so here is January 2015, and I'm going to show you slides that go January, February, March, and sort of click on, because I'm wondering if the blob is going to be intensifying off of our coast. So there's January, February, March. And to me, I think it looks like those waters are getting redder. So who knows? And I think more importantly, what will go on with the upwelling, because the upwelling that we had last year is really what allowed a lot of our coastal productivity to stay, quote unquote, somewhat normal. And if we have weak upwelling, it could be a very interesting year. And then lastly, I just wanted to show that this, Craig has made these calculations for basically the full satellite view, so you can scroll out. There's the March 2015 view, and similar to what we've been seeing. But just for your own giggles, there's the 1998 El Nino, January 1998, and so you can see a much different pattern. And I would have added the 2005 May pattern, but I didn't know about that till I sat through the morning sessions. So I encourage you to go onto the NANUS climatology app and look at the pattern compared to this, because there are some differences and there are some similarities. So that's the view from Washington State. Thank you. Oh, I forgot one last thing, and that is that, Bill, where are you? The time series from the Friday Harbor had the lowest harbor porpoise abundance on the 14-year record, and it was a low seabird year.
Thank you very much, Jan. Next, we have Joe Nidoba from Oregon State University.
Thank you. My name is Joe Nidoba. I'm actually from Portland, Oregon, Oregon Health and Science University. And some of the data I'm going to show you today comes from a program funded by the NSF Science and Technology Center. We call the Center for Coastal Margin Observation Prediction, and also part of NANUS. So I'd like to thank Jan and the organizers for helping me get down here today. This is great. Jan just showed you this. I'm going to show you some data from the Columbia River Estuary, so very near shore conditions. And I think it's clear from today's talks that there's this important strip of upwelled colder water that changed between January 2014 and actually more like October, but here's an example that, and Jan just showed it, January 2015. So the question is, do we see big changes in water quality conditions, temperature, but other important biogeochemistry conditions in our estuaries, in our nearshore environments? The answer is probably yes, but I'm going to show you some data. The Columbia River Estuary is an interesting environment because we, from the perspective of primary production, upwelling on the coast is important for producing phytoplankton. But also the Columbia River itself can be a very important source of organic matter and actually freshwater diatoms that come into the estuary. So our sensor, our observatory system and our sensor network tries to bridge this quite large gradient in freshwater to saltwater and sources of organic carbon. And actually it's become quite sophisticated because we have a lot of different things that we've added over the years, and including these biogeochemistry stations. But today I'm going to show you mostly data from the mouth of the Columbia River here, and not all the other stuff. So you've seen graphs like this already today. Francisco showed almost an identical thing where there's a year data set. These are all the years of temperature plotted over this period of time. In this case, I'm showing you from June to June, so 1 year feeds into the next. And so the gray is basically all the different temperature years from 1996. And much like the 2 talks ago where the lighthouse keeper uses the bucket, we sampled the data set at high tide. So what you're just seeing is the ocean water end member temperature concentration. And I think there's some points that have been made and are going to continue to be made, but I want to highlight a few things. So the red is the 2014 to 2015, so June 2014 till now. The blue is the 1997-98 El Nino event. And so, first of all, I think we saw the blob coming into the estuary for the first time in September, October 2014. We've heard that story a couple times. These dips in temperature then are due to localized upwelling events, making the water colder. And then in October, again, we saw that warm water and it never went away after that. Perhaps one little dip here, and then just now in April, we're starting to see the return of these upwelling water. Is higher than the El Nino conditions or comparable ever since October. I think that's significant in the sense that the biogeochemical and primary production of the 1997-98 El Nino on the coast was such that it was a very bad year. And we've heard and we know that a year ago, the upwelling was significant and we didn't have a bad year for primary production. So what happens this year is really probably going to depend on whether this El Nino forms or not and adds to this pattern. So all these low temperatures from June, July, August are representative of upwelling. Whereas you can see in the El Nino year, upwelling wasn't as significant in these years and led to warmer waters earlier. If I just show last year's data overlaid with these others, you can see that 2013 into spring of 2014, we saw actually very cold waters at the mouth of the Columbia. And then it began to warm up, and we got some really warm water. I have to go back and look more carefully whether this was the blob or what was going on here, but then it went back to being cold and upwelling, which is the red line. So we're capturing all the variability right at the nearshore part off the Oregon coast. And so I think that the story is how is upwelling going to develop this year? And much like Francisco drove the message home this morning, intermittent upwelling or long prolonged upwelling could have a significant impact on basically productivity at the mouth of the Columbia, which is for many of our reasons is important for salmon habitat and juvenile salmon survival. So the observatory network that I described at the beginning has a lot of more advanced sensors, and I didn't think in 10 minutes I would try to cover it all, but I just want to give you one quick example. And as we move forward, we're going to be relying heavily on some of these sensors to get a handle on biogeochemistry conditions. And instead of just showing you high tide here, this is April 2015. The top graph is temperature, and all three graphs are colored by salinity. So you can clearly see the daily change. This is a fixed station. You can see the fresh water and then the salt water. In the case of temperature, when the blob was certainly persistent, then the warmest water was also the saltiest water. Over April, the freshwater Columbia River has begun to warm up. But what we did get was this little upwelling event, which gave us colder, salty water in the estuary. And now it went away. So that's a little transient upwelling event that happened in April, and the blob seems to be back. If we look at DO, that salty water had low DO. That's representative of deep ocean, low oxygen water. So we're pretty comfortable with that. We have a nitrate sensor associated with this. It doesn't take samples quite as often, but it's still several times, or at least 10 times a day kind of thing. And I'll just guide your eye. So when we had the blob conditions, we had very low nitrate concentrations and much higher nitrate concentrations in the river, which is also normal for April. And the river concentrations are still quite high, but the ocean conditions are very low. But we see upwelling, bringing all the nitrate concentrations high, and then we've gone back. So capturing this type of variability, temporal variability, is really important to answer some of our questions, and I think will help us understand how the blob will or will not interact with upwelling this year. So I'm very excited to keep paying attention to all these sensors. So since I have a minute left here, I'll just show you one more example. And this is slightly more complicated. I think the question is, well, did the blob have an effect on chlorophyll biomass or on primary production? Here's some data from our chlorophyll sensor, still colored by salinity. And what we typically see off the coast of the estuary in the fall is a dominance of phytoplankton from the ocean that are growing. About the time that the blob showed up, we stopped seeing pretty much any phytoplankton in the ocean. That's also the fall-winter transition, so we sort of expect phytoplankton biomass to go down in the winter. And then in the spring, these large biomass or blooms of phytoplankton are really associated with the Columbia River, not the coast. And we will expect to see larger phytoplankton blooms, much like I'm showing here in August if upwelling continues. So I think with all these data sets combined, we'll likely capture these dynamics really well this year. And those are some of my conclusions. Basically, we detected, like everybody else did, I think, the anomaly coming to the coast in the fall, and that the temperatures were as high as the big El Nino event of 1997-98, and that the big question is the strength of upwelling as we move through to 2015. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Joe. Sorry about the wrong institution.
Oh, no, it's okay. Happens all the time.
Next up is Mike Cosgrove. He's from Oregon. Get the institution right here.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've seen off Oregon with the observing system that we have in place, largely due to NANUS. A number of people have contributed to this talk. Craig Rizian is a co-author. Ted Strube, Burke Hales, Jack Barth, Kip Sherman have all contributed information. And as Jan was noting, we have a really fine data and user products committee having input. The other person who deserves acknowledgement is Murray Levine, who led the mooring program for many years. So the mooring I'm going to talk about is NH10. It sits there. It's not showing up. The square on the map. We also have a number of other observing assets in the region. There's the NH10 mooring sits along the Newport hydrographic line, which was sampled for many years since the 1960s, so we have a good climatology for it. There's a NDBC buoy directly offshore from which we have winds available when it's staying where it was put. And more recently, a glider transect along the dashed line has been in place with repeated hydrographic measurements on a sort of a weekly or shorter basis. That's Slocum glider from Barth and Sherman. We also have remote sensing over the whole area with the satellite products and HF surface current mapping. I won't be showing any of those data today. And at the NH10 mooring, I forgot to point out, we have a large number of sensors in the vertical, usually 10 to 14 temperatures, 3 salinities, ADCP, winds, and now Hales's ocean acidification stuff. And then this is a well-modeled region. Alex Kurapov has a model to help us understand some of the observations. And in short time, the OOI endurance array will be in place to provide a lot more observing technology. So this is the time series of temperature at all the depths that we measure since 2006. You see a very strong seasonal cycle with stratification in the spring, summer, and well-mixed region in the winter. You also see numerous data gaps. These are due to the trying wave conditions that we have off the Oregon coast, which often move the mooring when the waves get over 25 feet. In order to solve that problem, we've just recently gone to a more slack mooring, but that brings problems of its own. This is the seasonal cycle that we see. In the first part of the year, things are well mixed. Come mid-March or early April, we start seeing cold water at the bottom, which quickly comes up to the surface. Strong stratification comes in. And then in the September-October timeframe, we have the fall transition. Warm water comes in from offshore and deepens the surface warm layer until we get to the well-mixed season. One of the problems I mentioned about having a more slack mooring is that the instruments are free to move around a little more. So these are 4 instruments on which we know where they are in pressure from October of 2014 until it was recovered just a month or so ago. The surface obviously doesn't move around much. We have an instrument in the anchor, which doesn't move around much, we hope. And the ones in between do have vertical excursions. So in order to make a sensible data set, we have to map first in the vertical to get fixed depths, and then show the results I'm going to show you. So making those mappings here, well, and not much mapping is needed. This is the top instrument, and this is the bottom. So 2 meters at the top, 83 meters at the bottom, and I think you can see that the period at the end of the record is anomalous compared to the others. Just to highlight it, I've highlighted the November through March time period, and you can see that those are all quite cool compared to the November 2014 to March 2015. What's impressive to me is how much warmer it is at the bottom at 83 meters between the previous year and the past year, the current year. Things always happen like this. The blue lines are the measurements that we have from the NH10 mooring. The pink line is filling in a gap where we were out of the water reworking the buoy. As you can see, that's when the Blob came ashore. But the strength and suddenness of that transition is incredibly impressive to me. If you focus in on the time period of that transition, the temperature rose from 12.5 degrees to 19 degrees in a matter of hours. Now, I don't know how much heating you expect, but that's advection. Where's the advection coming from? Well, Jan also mentioned this. This is a representation of the winds. This is using the upwelling index that NOAA PFEL puts out and integrating it in time so we get the cumulative upwelling index. And the slope of that curve gives you the rate at which water is being carried on or offshore. And where it turns around gives you an idea of where the offshore transports, when the offshore transport started or ended. And I've marked for your eye where the start of surface onshore local forcing is. Generally in the month of September, a little hiatus, and then a very strong forcing as the fall period progresses. So I showed you the top and bottom records. I'm now showing you the temperature and the temperature anomaly. I've cut out the bottom part of the temperature anomaly because we don't have a super long time series for that. But you can see that the temperature anomaly that we've captured comes in at 4 to 5 degrees in the middle of the water column after mid-October. And so this is felt throughout the water column. Another representation is from the repeat glider transects that Jack Barth, Kip Sherman, and co-workers have been collecting, and they sent along a couple of nice graphs of their results. This shows 5 transects along the Newport hydrographic line. Inshore is to the audience right, and these are temperature anomalies, removing the seasonal mean that they see. So in early September, not much happening, but by mid-September, by the transect that takes from the 14th to the 18th, we suddenly have a very strong warm anomaly at the surface, and the existing warm anomaly at the bottom is heating up. It fills in to some extent on the second transect and continues through the record. This is the last transect that they collected for NANUS. They've started collecting data for the OOI, and OOI rules don't allow those data to be disseminated yet, but they will be available. Instead, what they have is they've started collecting data along a line down off of Eureka, essentially, the Trinidad headline. And as you can see, that those data from January to April of 2015 are also quite high at 50 meters. There's several other things to show. I'd like to at least show you the blended altimetry product blended altimetry tide gauge product that was mentioned earlier. This is work that Craig Rizian did with Ted Strube using a technique that we developed a few years ago in a paper by Martin Saraceno. And so the map that you see are, the offshore is all the Aviso satellite altimetry, but right along the coast are data that have been matched to coastal tide gauges. So we'll follow the temperature, we'll follow the sea level height, and in the plots, which is way too much detail for you to absorb, I'm sorry about that, we'll go month by month and look at the barometric pressure in the top, air temperature anomaly, water temperature anomaly, and wind anomalies. So this is January 2014. February, still below normal along the northwest coast. March, we're starting to see things returning to normal in sea level. April, getting higher. May, June, July, August. Now there's considerable increase in the offshore sea level anomaly. September, very strong along the coast. And unfortunately, that's where the Aviso data stop in the approved format. So I won't show you any more of that, but it will be available soon. The last thing I want to mention is to reiterate what Jan said. This NANUS visualization system, or NVS, has a wealth of data and analyses available, and I encourage you to explore it. The climatology app she mentioned and showed an example like that. There are others. This is a seasonal anomalies of SST. Winter and summer anomalies are shown. Obviously, the anomaly for 2015 is a strong outlier. And Jan showed a number of these, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mike. And we have Jennifer Fisher.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Fisher, and I'm here basically presenting Bill Peterson, who unfortunately couldn't make it here. The last few talks have been a great setup for what I'll be talking to you about today. I'll basically be presenting data from twice-monthly surveys that we've been conducting off of Newport, Oregon, from shipboard in situ measurements since 1996. And I think you'll see that basically the story is just going to be a variation on a common theme that we've been seeing here. So as Mike nicely pointed out, upwelling off of Oregon in 2014 was actually slightly above normal. However, the beginning of the upwelling season was delayed. It was very similar to that which occurred in 2005. And then the fall transition occurred about on time, and as soon as the fall transition occurred, the blob basically came ashore. And so even though upwelling was slightly higher than average within that year, it was the shortest upwelling season that we had seen, very similar to 2005. Even though it was normal, in the middle of the upwelling season, in July, these are transects that we conduct from the shore out to 25 miles offshore. And you can see that there's this surface layer of slightly warm temperature that's about 14 degrees. And this is in the middle of the upwelling season. So even though upwelling was slightly higher than normal, we're already seeing warm water. Then as Mike showed, these are buoy data, hourly buoy data from the buoy 20 miles offshore, and their sea surface temperatures. And they're anomalies, and you can see that basically 14th of September at 10 p.m., we see these huge rises in sea surface temperature anomalies of about 4 degrees C. And the black dots overlaying these teal bars are the surface temperatures from 97, 98. So we're seeing increases in temperature very similar to the 97, 98 El Nino. And then surveys following when this blob came ashore off of Newport in September and October, you can see now that the water temperature is warm down to about 20 to 30 meters, and it's relatively fresh. We see salinity is actually in 32. And then later in the year, we see that warm water is deepening. And we get 14, 15 degree water down to 80 meters, very similar to what Jan was showing. And our cruises later in the year and in January to March of this year have basically seen the same patterns. And what others have, we've also noted what others have, and that this warm water is basically in the upper 100 meters. So these data are actually, so now we're looking at the time series from 1997 to present. And these are temperature and salinity anomalies. And so you can see the really strong patterns of the temperature, warm temperature during the 97, 98 El Nino. And the temperatures that we've observed the last year coming into 2015 are actually higher at 50 meters than they were during 1997, 98. And you can also see that the water was quite fresh. So from the beginning of 2014, we've seen the freshest water that's occurred off of our coast since the last 20 years. And then in November, we really see this spike increase in temperature anomalies, and that are 3 degrees above normal. And if we compare this to the deep temperature and salinity, so this is our temperature and salinity data off of a shelf station, so located at 150 meters water depth, you really see that strong, warm, and fresh signal of the El Nino, but you do not see any, I mean, it's mildly warm, but it's not a strong signal, this warm, previous or recent warm event. And then if we take a look at what the biology are doing, so we had some nice talks earlier talking about these kind of southern and northern copepod groups. We use these as indicators of basically the bioenergetics of the food chain. So our southern copepods are generally composed of coastal and oceanic species, whereas the northerns are mainly composed of coastal species that have boreal affinities, whereas the southerns have more subtropical affinities. So here we're looking at the entire time series with the PDO and the El Nino index on the top panel. And you can really see that these copepod anomalies, or the biomasses, the changes of these anomalies really mirror kind of this PDO pattern. And if you look at the most recent event in 2014 and 15, it doesn't look any different than the rest of the time series. So if we were just to look at these indicators, which we have been shown to be very good indicators of, say, for salmon returns, nothing looks out of the ordinary here. And it looks basically just like a positive PDO year or an El Nino year. And here again, you can see, so the PDO was positive for basically all of 2014, and we didn't see increased southern species and decreased northern species until November of that year. And that's possibly because there's, this is following this very cold period of PDO, and I think there's memory in this biological system here, and it takes a while for these organisms to turn over and for advection to really have an effect. However, if we look at the number of different copepod species that were occurring off of our coast, we generally find that very subtropical and tropical waters are more speciose. And so here we see over the course of the time series that the warm event, we had many more species off of our coast than we had occurred in the 97-98 El Nino. And actually, Bill has now recorded 17 new copepod species since he's been counting plankton samples for the last, I was just going to say 30 years, but it's been longer. And a lot of these species have oceanic and he will say tropical affinities, but a lot of the species he actually doesn't know. So we're uncertain of their affinities. And so these are taxa that are being advected likely into our region from either farther offshore or from further afar from coastal regions than we would normally see during other really warm events. And then I'm going to present just a little data from Toby Oth and Elizabeth Daly, who look at our samples and they look at the ichthyoplankton. This is what I was speaking to earlier, where they've seen a really high biomass of northern anchovies and rockfish larvae. And northern anchovy larvae apparently were collected during the El Nino event of '98 and the warm event in 2003, but the biomasses that they're seeing in 2015 are over 100 times greater. So they're also seeing extremely high biomass of sardine larvae, which apparently is unprecedented off of the coast of Newport. They've also collected 3 new taxa, including Pacific sauri larvae. So I was just offshore last week. We sampled out to 200 miles, and the spring transition, the physical spring transition was basically on time this year. It was around tax day. We sampled basically right after that. And you can see, these are contours just out to 25 miles. You can see that we're starting to get salinity contours that are moving up towards the coast. We're seeing this colder water that's coming up. We had really high productivity near shore, but that was only out to about 10 miles, which generally when upwelling begins, we'll see that out over the shelf. And then if we extend that out to 200 miles, we actually see that it's actually about 12 degrees, almost exactly what Jan was saying, out to 200 miles, and that is about 80 meters water depth. So upwelling has been initiated near the coast, but it hasn't affected anything past what we're seeing out to 10 miles offshore. And Bill just called me on my way down here, and he had just sorted the sample that we collected off of the shelf, and the copepod community there, even though upwelling has been initiated for a couple weeks, is still in this warm southern community. And so, as others have said, I think it'll be really interesting to see if an El Nino occurs and how upwelling is affected, what will then happen to the copepod community. Because from our data, we've seen that the more persistent and the longer these warm events have occurred, the longer it takes for these communities to then get back to normal. So if we do end up having an El Nino and we have reduced upwelling, we could be in for trouble, especially considering juvenile salmon are about to go to sea in the next couple weeks, and if they don't have any food and it's warm, it might not be a very good year for them. That's it.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. And Jan is going to lead our discussion, so it'd be nice to have all the presenters from the session up front. And we'll do this.
So I'm waiting for
you
Sam.
might. It won't.
Go ahead, just
And the
fill
other
in.
side of the integrated ecosystem program.
Move your head that way.
All right. Quite a cast of characters. Okay, so there must be some good questions for this group from Alaska to Oregon. All right, Uwe and then you. Oh, we need the microphones, and so if somebody could. Oh, we need this one?
I have a question to Mike Cosrow. I'm here. I think you showed, when you showed the sudden transition in the temperature within a few hours in September, you said this must be advection, and I think you implied that it would be on offshore advection because you talked about the switch to downwelling. So I think you were trying to say, or at least the message I got with that slide was that there's warm water further offshore which now is being transported towards the coast in a downwelling situation. Is that right? That was what you were trying to say? Because then I got confused when you showed the glider sections, which until September did not show any warm water further offshore. So that couldn't have, at least based on the glider sections, it couldn't have come from offshore, this warm water.
Yeah, that's a good thought. The thing is that the glider sections take 4 to 7 days to run, so you can get aliasing of gradients along that line fairly easily, and I suspect that's what's happened. That's the only scenario I can put together as cross-shore advection for.
Yeah, but even that there was a glider section 1 or 2 weeks before in early September, and there was no warm water anomaly anywhere along that glider section.
That's true. The glider section is of limited length as well. So,
okay. How far offshore does it go?
I'm not 100% sure, but probably at least 100. It's about 100 kilometers, something like that.
Okay.
Craig, do you know? Right.
So they kind of blame.
Yeah, this was only the sloping that I was, yeah.
So some data that I didn't show from Cheba that's relevant to this discussion is as soon as that switch happens, the currents, we had ADCP currents, actually showed a strong currents from the south. But you know, at what point does the train connect? So it was very interesting dynamics there. Okay, another question? Dan, did you want to comment on
Does this thing work?
Yeah? Yes, it is.
Mike, it's for you. It's the same question. It's a very important observation, that rapid a change. And I'm asking, and which you attribute to advection for sure. Is there, are there any salinity data? Do we know that there's a density signal?
There are salinity data. I didn't show them because they're not that dramatic. They do show slightly lower salinity in the water that's coming ashore. But
I would have thought so. Yeah.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, salinity should be a lot higher if it's warm, advected water.
I think the usual is for the. Anyway, the water, the change is not strong. I can show you the plot. But,
all right, thanks.
Yeah.
I think also in the abstract that I have with John Mickett, it shows salinity or density in there.
Yeah,
so,
it's density that we're after.
Yes.
The signal.
Yes.
I'm wondering.
I can't remember it, and I didn't show it, but the temperature was much more dramatic than the density. Yeah.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Sorry. Shall I go? I'm a bit confused with something. Francisco Chavez, he was discussing Central California, and he said that the anomaly started there in July. However, in the northwestern Pacific, it's arriving much later. Any idea why? Why is that? I don't get it. Don't quite get it.
So So the upwelling was strong until we got to the end of September. So we had cooler than normal temperatures off of Washington and Oregon until that. And I'm
so that kept it offshore for
yes.
a while, and then it
yes,
came,
yes. And then that's what we're talking about, is this advection onshore or some other complex circulation that gets it onshore.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mark?
A question for Chris and Yamal. I'm trying to reconcile what I couldn't quite reconcile in your talks. So, Chris, you referred to the intrusion of southern copepods and the smaller than average body size of the animals. And Yamal, you referred to lipid-rich zooplankton, euphausids, and an amphipod that seem to be large body-sized animals. And I'm not quite sure how to put those two together.
So I think one way might be that most of the copepod species in the area that along the Seward line, and I'm speaking for Russ, so are going to be more the northern species. And so we saw very few of, but just their presence alone was unusual. So those southern species were not a large part of the overall zooplankton population at all. But just seeing any of them was unusual.
And we highlighted the zooplankton that are most abundant where we were, but also those are big players in fish diets, and we're more focused on fish and understanding recruitment processes and dynamics. So that's why we didn't show all the zooplankters, but cherry-picked those.
Yeah, so we cherry-picked different species.
Okay, that answers it. Thank you.
Okay, there's a hand up over there, and Bill, a hand up there. So first we'll go to Shell and then Bill. If you can give him the microphone.
So my question's for Peter. And I had a question about, you were showing, and I hope I get this right, you were showing all these SST anomalies and trying to attribute those to temperature anomalies. And you showed a mechanism for that attribution, which was you had a northerly flow that was going across the warm SST anomaly across Alaska, which then showed these warm temperature anomalies. But the SST anomalies are strongly correlated with these anomalous atmospheric, so pressure anomalies. So you get these high pressure centers that affect the storm tracks. So the high pressure causes the warm SST anomaly. So how are you figuring out whether anomalous circulation patterns because of the pressure anomalies are responsible for the temperature, or it's the SST responsible for the temperature? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess...
is it the ocean is it the ocean affecting this, or is it the atmosphere actually affecting both?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, actually. I mean, in the case of mine, we focus more on the storm tracks, and those were linked more to El Nino and ENSO. I think Uma, actually, you showed some of the, maybe you can also answer that.
Pass the buck.
Pass it, here you go.
So in the mid-latitude ocean atmosphere, most of the, at least from my education, is most of the forcing is the atmosphere forcing the ocean. And that's a really good question in terms of, maybe a better way would have been to say that these are, but then there is some feedback of the ocean back onto the atmosphere, though that's a smaller part of the maybe 20%. I don't know exactly what that percentage is, but that you're right that it's the atmosphere that is, I would say the atmosphere is leading to these ocean circulation changes. I think in Peter's work, that what he showed was that we have a longer persistence in the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, so we can, to predict March, April air temperatures, we can look back a few months and see those large-scale patterns, which are noisier in the atmosphere and they're smoother in the ocean. So that persistence helps us with prediction.
Okay, Bill and then Nick.
Yeah, my question is for Jamal. Most of what you talked about were positive biological effects. It seemed like positive zooplankton, positive pink salmon. But you also mentioned that that the catch rate for herring declined from sort of an average of 140,000 metric tons in Sitka Sound down to 8, so about 5% of the typical catch for herring. I wonder if you had any other comments about that, because that's clearly something that's pretty different. And it also matches the St. Lazaria seabird data, where there was a big decline in their breeding success. But you didn't talk much about herring. So just wondering what else you thought about that.
Yeah, no, I think the first place to look would be predators, a new suite of predators that have moved up into the area that might have hammered the herring. But having such a drastic degree in the decrease in their populations, like I had mentioned in Prince William Sound, they just kind of disappeared. We had a huge age class, you know, and are they somewhere else that we're not looking? That could possibly be it. But as far as the Sitka Sound herring fishery, I'm not sure. I know herring are known to boom and bust, but that was definitely unexpected. So I would guess that it's either they got hammered by the predators, or you know, these warm waters are kind of confusing them and sending them to different places, potentially delaying spawning. So maybe that you know, that year class is still out there somewhere, but it just didn't return for whatever reason, whatever physical signals were out there.
Nick.
Yeah, this is more of a comment, but what has come up in the last a few of these talks here is how important the upwelling is in the warm season, the productivity, and maybe some speculations about what we can look for in the upcoming summer, and some recent work that actually one of my COSRO's colleagues, Roger Samuelson, has come up with is a little bit counterintuitive, and that might be that the warm water will actually cause greater upwelling. And the way it works there is a little different than what it was first thought. It was first thought that maybe with colder water offshore and warmer inland temperatures that would drive pressure gradient and more north winds. It turns out more that the momentum in the atmosphere is mixed down to cause you know, the stress on the ocean during when that it's less stable when the ocean is warmer. So all things being equal, we could maybe expect some stronger north winds, and maybe the atmosphere will, you know, help us keep it a little more productive this summer coming up otherwise. And I would just invite anybody else to comment on that also if they've heard about that. I don't know, Art, if... Well, a little bit of that, but just stronger winds, stronger surface wind speeds, just because of the stability effect mixing those.
Exactly.
Right there. Yeah.
That just changes the distribution of wind stress curl offshore.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. True.
Not the coastal upwelling, which is right at the coast, right? Differentiating Ekman offshore transport coastal upwelling from open ocean wind stress curl.
Yes. Yes. That's right.
Okay, I see another hand in the back of the room, Dave. So, well, we're getting a microphone there. Yeah, that could be really interesting. I mean, obviously, last year we had strong upwelling and we had warm waters. Will that same mechanism repeat?
Yeah, and I'll just throw in for us, we have such a big input from buoyancy flux. So that density equation is really driven more by the buoyancy flux than the thermal changes. So it'd be hard to mix that out.
Just two comments. One is in regard to what Jamal said, and also what Nick just said. Pink salmon, if I understand correctly, use the broad North Pacific for feeding when they're at sea. And they're somewhat unique in the sense that we get a signal ashore in terms of what the habitat is for the broader North Pacific. And so that they're a really interesting species, it would seem to me, to look at to see their response to a change in the broad North Pacific. And things like looking at the del O18 of the oxygen, the otoliths, and the growth rate from rings in the otoliths, and other things might be telling in this case, because to my knowledge, they're one of the few exploited species that live that way. And the other thing that interests me is that, you know, how Rukazuski and Dunn proposed that under a warmer climate, that the source of the upwelled waters for the California current would be further to the northwest, the transit time would be longer, and that the quality of the water would be different, higher in nitrate. And this is probably totally ludicrous, but it would be interesting to look 25 years down the line, or whenever the water that was formed this year appears in the coast, to see if there's a signal in the time series of nitrate that's actually brought up in the California current. I'm not going to be around then, Nick, you will be, I'm sure. But at any rate, you see what I'm saying, that there's a really strong signal that we've had this last year or 2 years. Wouldn't it be interesting to see a manifestation of it in terms of the water that's being brought up in the current during upwelling some decades later, or even sampled as it makes its way over here in the next decade or two?
I think that's a really interesting idea, Dave, about, you know, recognizing that the water that is in contact with the atmosphere now is going to be visiting us at some point in the future. So, interesting. Francisco.
Dave, you don't have to wait 25 years. I think it's happening already.
Can you elaborate?
I think you know, with the decrease in oxygen and increases in CO2 and nitrate in the source waters, that's essentially what we're seeing. We're seeing the Rishkashevsky and Dunn effect already. Now you're talking about something a little bit different, maybe.
And I'll just point out one of my data gap needs or whatever is always around nutrients, always where we are.
And sorry, I had another comment from Mike and the onshore advection, which, yes, I think is happening and sort of would happen in the winter. But Uwe was talking about not having anomalies offshore. You don't have to have anomalies offshore, you just have to have warmer water, right? So
Absolutely.
That you could have this warm water that comes closer to shore and creates an anomalously warm water close to shore. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, that all the graphs were in terms of anomalies. That's right.
But if you look at the satellite, the transition from, like, say, when we were in upwelling to downwelling, those were in anomaly, and you could see that, I mean, it was red and then blue during the upwelling season, and then everything's red. So.
Yeah, that's the same point.
Yeah.
So I have to, I'd like to ask Jennifer Fisher about the sardine anchovy, of course.
I don't know anything about fish.
Get the mic to Jennifer.
I think it was either 2005 or 2006, NOAA did some sampling up off the area where you're working around Newport and so forth, and they found sardine eggs and larvae. But Nancy Lowe calculated that it was contributed to only a small fraction, maybe 3 or 5% of the spawning stock biomass. So have you actually had time to compare your densities of eggs and larvae to the 2005-2006 data that NOAA has? And you said they were high. I guess I'm saying, how high were they?
Well, I need to clarify that those data are actually from Toby Oth and Elizabeth Daly, and I do not generate them or have anything to do with them. So I will have to ask them that question, because I do not know. 2003 and 98, correct, yeah. So I'm not sure about 2005.
So they have been compared to the NOAA data, or are these other data?
All of the data that I'm pretty sure they were presenting there were from the Newport line, so not from, I think, the NOAA data that you're talking about.
Okay. Because the eggs that we got in the offshore on the spring survey were very, very low densities, and they were 50 to 60 miles offshore in a band between south of Newport down to Coos Bay, and there were very low densities of sardine eggs.
Well, that's something that we talked about a little bit, and it might have been, it'll be interesting to look at the data that we just collected out to 200 miles to see if we saw that also the sardine eggs further offshore. Because again, those data are mainly from that shelf band out to 25 miles. So it'll be an interesting comparison.
I also want to invite anyone up in the peanut gallery to ask a question. And if you do, we're just going to repeat it. So please don't. Yes, okay, you.
I had a question for Joe about the Columbia River vital thing.
Yeah, so the question is how do we know that the source of organic carbon switches from the Columbia River input versus upwelling? And so the Columbia River estuary, the salt wedge component is typically heterotrophic most of the time, and it gets its organic carbon from either of those two sources. And there's a very clear spring bloom in the Columbia River, and we've done taxonomy on the phytoplankton and their freshwater diatoms all the time. And they're very different than the saltwater diatoms that we see. But they don't really make it through the estuary. They die, they break apart, and vice versa. The saltwater phytoplankton coming into the estuary tend to also stop growing, and they get eaten and they break apart. So we have tracked those dynamics carefully, and the types of diatoms are completely different. Does that answer your question? So the river acts like a temperate lake or the temperate ocean, where we have a big spring bloom, and then nutrients tail off, and there's no replenishment of nutrients because they're just gone until the next season of rain and wash off from the land, whereas the ocean behaves much more based on upwelling. So they're temporally offset.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yeah, it's about the record of southern species that you were talking about, zooplankton. And for me, that makes sense with the higher than usual salinities, but this seems not to be the case. That you were mentioning that you observed some fresher waters and onshore advection. So is this onshore advection bringing fresher waters to the coast? And it's consistent with southern advection of tropical species? It's kind of not the whole picture for me.
Yeah, it could also, I mean, I don't think we know that, at least for the data along the Seward line. Russ Hopcroft would have a better idea of that, or Sonia Batten. But it could also be increased transport in the Alaska coastal current, and that increased advection up the coast as well, because we're on the shelf there, so that would be another mechanism. But I don't know that we know the answer.
Yeah, thanks. My specialty isn't zooplankton, but I do know there's the question in terms of the composition of these groups and the southern copepods that we see. I think the question arises is whether they're tropical in origin or whether they're oceanic in origin, and I don't think there's enough discrimination right yet at present to make that decision. But I think that's where some of the answers will come, and that just becomes, I guess, a matter of discriminating the zooplankton species a little bit more carefully.
Anybody else for that? Jennifer?
I definitely agree with that, and I think that's why it's really interesting, the two plots that I showed where our southern species were not anomalously high, and that's because it's a combination of both oceanic and coastal species. But then when we did see really high species richness, it's generally from species that are coming from likely further offshore, or like I said, further afar. So it's interesting. You need to speciate the zooplankton for sure.
You mentioned the salinity signal, and I checked, thanks to Jen on her laptop. There's a figure in my abstract, and it actually does show that when that warm, anomalously very warm water comes onshore, when we switch to downwelling, that actually is a much lower salinity, at least for the La Push station. So that's a very interesting signal. All right, any other questions for this group? Yes, Bill. Well, he's waiting for the microphone. I'm going to ask Peter a question about the salmon migration around the northern, whether they go north or south. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that, what that's normally driven by, and then what you think was going on this last year?
Well, I think this is driven primarily by the conditions that the salmon are feeling as they return to spawn. So they've been in the ocean for a while. And I'm not exactly sure how that formula works. It's quite magical. But I do know that part of that is the sea surface temperatures. And that typically in a regular year, they would increasingly, or they would progressively increase during the season. This year, however, the spot that they measured at Keynes Island had a very, very warm May, anomalously warm May, and then a bit of a cooling period in June. And they really didn't know how, then of course the formula didn't work. They got negative values and they didn't quite know what to do. But the observations, which is done when the actual salmon migrate and they either go through northern Vancouver and then they count them, I guess, it was coincidental with anomalously high diversion rates through northern, around the northern Vancouver Island routes. So it's coincidental right now. I don't know if it's an ecosystem indicator that is doing it or if it's straightly a physical condition. But all we can say is that the results from last year was remarkable.
Right. I was just wondering if that northern route is taken in other warm years.
It is taken in norm years, and that's why it typically favors norm years, warmer years, but that's not exclusively why it happens. Okay. There are other conditions.
Great, thank you. Bill?
Yeah, my question is for Uma and Peter, and it has to do with the mechanism of warming in the Gulf of Alaska. So before the workshop, the story that I understood at the time was really that it was lack of storms, winter storms, that led to the warming because there was an interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean that would have removed that heat content in the ocean. So I'm just wondering what the story really is now, because both of you talked about storms to some extent, and really, was there a decrease in the storm track or the storms coming through that led to the warming?
We were looking at the impact. We were starting with the warm anomalies and then saying, what are the storm tracks doing? And the warming we were talking about was over land. So it wasn't coincidence. So again, we're using these sea surface temperatures as a way to predict what's going to happen over Alaska. So we weren't talking about what's forcing the warm water. We're starting at that point.
So you didn't address that particular
It's not something
side
it's not something we've looked at. So
do we still think? What do we think about that? Is that it? I mean, what caused the warming? Was it lack of storms in the Gulf of Alaska?
Well, typically during El Nino years, the storm tracks are farther south, so that there's less storminess over Alaska or in southern Alaska, and that keeps during the springtime, and that keeps things clearer. So when it's clearer in spring, it warms up the surface, and that mechanism is pretty clear in terms of how it impacts now. We just feel confident about that piece of the story.
Well, yeah, and I also, as part of this, I remember that plot with the grid of anomalies and storms. I also did a correlation with that SSTs. Uma had prepared one for over the Nick Bonds, that region. And we had found that there is a weak correlation, like reduced storms in the Gulf of Alaska, but it's not very strong. It's like maybe 0.4 at most there. But yeah, we don't have a particular cause and effect there.
Thank you. And if you go further on, now that the stratification is set up, I think what is likely is that for that to break down, we're going to need some storms. That's the only mechanism that I can see that's actually going to break that up. So I'm not quite sure how it started, but until that energy comes from the atmosphere, that it's going to stay as a fairly stratified surface layer.
Okay, well, are we saturated? I think that probably was our last question, so I just want to thank all these Pacific Northwest speakers.
Thank you. Good morning. And today we're going to continue the second day of the Pacific Anomalies Workshop. We're going to be continuing with the Pacific Southwest, and Toby Garfield from the Fisheries is going to be our first speaker.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you all for this meeting, and I really appreciated yesterday seeing progress everybody is making. The foundation of this talk was given to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. They have an environmental requirement in making some of their stock decisions. And about 3 weeks ago, my boss, Cisco Werner, was giving a seminar here at Scripps and went through a lot of this, and I was sitting next to Julie and Danielle, and I heard Julie lean over and said, this is the talk we need for this meeting. So thank you, Julie. My co-author is Chris Harvey, who's up at the Northwest, and the whole California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team, which actually, there are a number of people in this room who have contributed to that. There are about 50 people, either in NOAA, in government service, NGOs, or academia, who have participated in this. So it's been a very major effort to really start pulling stuff together for people. So I don't have any data. Thank you. I've stolen data from all of you, and I really appreciate that. But our job is really trying to pull this all together. And the nice thing was that all of the pieces do seem to be fitting together into a very nice puzzle. So I thank all of the investigators who have supplied so much information. So our job is to take all that information and make it relevant to people. And that's not easy to do. We have another mandate, so you all are doing the first bullet up there, climate, and we have to look at everything else. And the way we've been doing that is through this ecosystem, integrated ecosystem assessment. And you know, NOAA really takes the science and has to translate it for other people. And two of our primary customers at this point are the marine sanctuaries. They're coming up and having to do their condition reports, so they're on the protection side of this. And our other main customer right now is the Pacific Fisheries Marine Council, so they're on the exploitation side of this. So really we have this two hats that we're spinning around in circles half the time, where you're talking about how do you provide enough protection so you can sustainably exploit the fisheries? And that's kind of where I think we are in a lot of this. So one of the things for us is really talking to the public. And so one of the things I think this El Nino slide, or this Pacific anomaly slide, points out some of the things that we have to be aware of and some of the things I've noticed in the talk here today. So first of all, we start with anomalies. Well, if you're going to talk about anomalies, you got to talk about what the anomalies are based on. And almost everybody here had a different time period for basing their anomalies. And so there's a lot of inconsistencies. So when you're trying to pull out some information, it can be often very difficult to talk about what the anomalies mean. The other is most people don't understand that a ½ degree shift is huge and a 3 to 4 degree shift is unprecedented. And so you have to talk about what these temperature shifts mean, both in terms of climate, but also in terms of the metabolism for those exothermic species in the ocean. So you've got to do that. Most non-scientists will say, what is El Nino? Can you describe El Nino? So one of the things I've started doing is saying, well, let's talk about this box here from 120 to 170 and plus or minus 5 degrees. You average that. That's the basis of it. But I heard yesterday, I heard El Nino, I heard ENSO, I heard MEI, I heard Nino 3.4, I heard ONI. So it's really difficult to figure out exactly, we haven't developed a common language for doing this, and yet if I were to talk to any one of you, you would say, well, I have to use MEI because you have to have this multivariate, or I have to do ONI because you've got to have that time series or whatever. So I'm not trying to tell you what to use, I'm just telling you that these are some of the concerns that when you're trying to explain to the public what you've got to be aware of. And the other is, I'm a little bit surprised because we've heard a lot about the blob. Unfortunately, Mexican colleagues have not named El Blobo, and so the warmth, the heating off of Baja and Mexico really is different. And yet, I haven't heard people talking on this meeting about how it's different and how this whole situation really is different from El Nino. John McGowan yesterday used the term lots of wiggles. All of us, we look at this diagram and say, wow, look at those basin scale indices and how they flipped in 2013. Well, a lot of wiggly lines don't mean a whole lot to other people. So yes, the PDO, the NPGO, the MEI have all swapped in the last couple of years, but trying to talk to the public, a better way is to throw up some examples where they can see those differences. Here is the April 15th image, satellite image, for 2013, 14, 15. 2013 was record upwelling on the West Coast, but also offshore. It was mostly cold. 2014 was kind of average. But the interesting thing about 2014 is there was a really strong north-south variability in the upwelling. So, and that we've seen reflected in a number of the talks here. And 2015, we're starting out with, I don't know, because it's so warm at this point. The other is, to help relate it to people, is it's not just the ocean that's so anomalously warm. So on the upper right there, that's the average California air temperature going back to, I think, 1900. And again, just like in Nick's box where the seawater temperature, surface temperature has just jumped up unprecedented, so has the integrated California temperature. So it's not just the ocean, it's the atmospheric as well, and it comes back to how you explain El Nino to people. And I think Peter explained these diagrams yesterday. The smooth line is the daily average temperature. And then superimposed on that is the daily temperature values. And so what you're seeing in red is basically the anomaly, what's going on. And what I think is important about here is this warmth in the last couple of years. It's not because we had that 2-week hot spell that we all hate. It's because it was warm every single day. So this gives you some nice evidence of the fact that the temperatures just about every day were warmer than normal. And I pulled off the same data for Alaska, and almost everywhere around Alaska was the same. I was really surprised and quite discouraged. So, and the other aspect of this is for bringing in the human dimension of this is you've got to talk about precipitation on the West Coast. And so here are 3 images. I grabbed this from the New York Times, but I'm sure it's from NASA. But 2013, they had 40% of the snow equivalent index. 2014, snow equivalent index was down to 25% of normal, and this last year it was down to 5% of normal. And in California, of course, it's drought. Up north, they had the normal amount of precipitation, but because it was so much warmer, it came as rain and not snow. So we have no reservoir anywhere on the West Coast. So then the next thing you've got to do is, okay, you've talked about these basin scale things. Now you've got to go and talk about upwelling. And this is one of the reasons why I was asking Francisco if there was any change in the phytoplankton, because you want to try to build this into the whole food chain. So the source waters are determined by the basin scale processes, but the productivity along the California coast, as we all know, is due to the upwelling. So how do you explain upwelling? Well, again, we can go to nice wiggly lines where this is the cumulative upwelling index. The blue is 2013, where we had record upwelling up north, but you can see 2014 was average or below average, and I grabbed the wrong set of slides because I had 2015 on there as well. Another way of looking at this, and I put this up, I was originally going to talk about upwelling, but instead what I noticed was that if you look at March, April of all these locations of last year and compare them to March, April of this year, the ocean is 3 degrees warmer than it was last year coming into the upwelling season. So I'm just floored about, well, I'm worried about what's going on here. So one of the ways we've been trying to put this together to talk to the public is develop these conceptual models. So here's an example of talking about salmon and just graphically trying to show all the ecological, the environmental, the human dimensions that are related to this. And this can be many, many layers deep. So you can take this and here's the top one, the environmental drivers. Here's the, if you start looking at ecological interactions, so as salmon come into the, well, first of all, the salmon in the freshwater, it's hot. There's dams, they're not getting what they need in the freshwater, but then they come into the ocean, and what we've seen from the talks that we heard yesterday, the food source isn't there, and of course they're going to be preyed on. So it gives you a way to talk about what's going on here, and frankly, 2 years from now, I think salmon escapement is going to be terrible. So I think salmon season just opened. If you want salmon, you better go get it now. And then we have a whole bunch of diagrams like this where we show long time series, the last 5 years, and the trends that are related to it, and I'm almost out of time. But one of the things we do is try to concentrate on human activities. For instance, seafood demand has been level, but due to the per capita, but due to the population increase, the demand for seafood has gone up. We provide less than 10% of the seafood consumed in this country, so you start building in those. And another thing we've tried to do is talk about how vulnerable people are to this climate change. So this is an example for fisheries, how vulnerable the species are, and how easy it is for fishermen to adapt their fishing techniques. So it's very difficult if you're a market squid fisherman, it's pretty hard to do anything else because of the gear you've got on your boat. And finally, everybody else has done a great job talking about data access and data sources. Most of the diagrams that I've shown here came from the Coastwatch website. New website was just unveiled on April 20th. I really encourage you to go there. We've got about 800 data sets now available. And I think Dan Rankin can give you an idea of the user experience. Dan Rudnick, excuse me. And so with that, I'll stop.
Much, Toby. And next we have Eric Borchstedt from Southwest Fisheries also.
Good morning, I'm Eric Bjorkstead. I'm with Southwest Center, stationed up at Humboldt State University near the Oregon border. As far away from La Jolla as you can get in California, just about. Co-authors on this are my super tech, Roxanne Robertson, who makes all this data collection happen, and Bill Peterson, who's been both a mentor and a great collaborator in helping us get a lot of this work done. To give you some sense of where we are providing these observations from, we are in the middle of what used to be nowhere, up there between San Francisco and the Newport hydrographic line. We were established in 2006 to try to fill that gap, or take a step to filling that gap. I will be talking mostly about data collected at the station Trinidad Head TH02, which is our mid-shelf station, about 75 meters of water, 5 nautical miles offshore. And part of the collaboration, which I won't talk about today, we're comparing observations from Newport and Trinidad because we do basically much of the same sampling. We go out monthly, they go out biweekly, but we use the same ring nets, the same taxonomic analysis and things like that. They are in a place where upwelling is fairly simple in structure, wide retentive shelf. We're in a location where we start getting south into the Capes, a lot of mesoscale activity, and a very narrow shelf. But I'll be focusing on just observations from Trinidad today. So we did see invasion of the Blob, or collapse of the coastal cool corridor, because I love to alliterate. These are, do we have a pointer that functions here? These are from our CTD cast just for the upper 150 meters. Temperature, salinity, density, chlorophyll, and dissolved oxygen. Starting from, this is June 2014, our June cruise. July, this is August, September, and October. Things look nice, and this is actually super productive right here. It looked quite, the upwelling that we saw coming out of 2013, we were seeing strong upwelling, we were seeing productivity. But as everyone else has reported, eventually the warm water started to come in and fully showed up late fall here. We actually, for a long time, in the temperature anomaly maps along the coast, were in that patch where things looked normal before the blob came from either the north or the south. We're not sure which one we got. It's a short time series. Toby just said you have to specify your thing. I'm going to leave this as an exercise to the reader to calculate the anomaly. Get out your pencils. But you can see that this is very much warmer than the typical, for instance, October throughout our time series. We did get, do occasionally get some warm water coming in, but nothing like what we see here. And also fresher at depth, like others have reported. It does seem to go a little bit deeper than 100 meters, but it still seems to be fairly surface oriented. One thing that we do look at to try to capture what's really going with respect to upwelling is we look at water characteristics near the bottom at that mid-shelf station. What we have here is the light gray are the observations from the years 2008 to 2013, where we have our more consistent sampling. The black symbols indicate observations during 2014. We see the warm water completely dominating the mid-shelf station late in that year, and the open circles are the observations to date that we have in 15 for temperature, salinity, mean chlorophyll over the upper 30 meters, and dissolved oxygen. You can see we did have quite an excursion away from our normal range on the TS plot, but now we're kind of back into a normal kind of configuration in 2015. This was also just a plug for some of the Senkus work. This kind of warm water coming on and then persisting through the winter was corroborated by observations at the Trinidad head wharf that Senkus supports. We do, like I said, we do the same community analysis that Bill Peterson does, so and his group does. We ring nets, turn them into samples, send it to this guy who does his Scottish voodoo on this and turns it into something only mildly more interpretable. But Bill's been great, and I really wish he was here to appreciate this ribbing. But then we also follow their lead and apply non-metric multidimensional scaling, NMDS, to look at community structure. This is the plot for our stations. We have, the samples dominated by cold neritic species fall out here, subarctic species fall out here, the warm oceanic, warm neritic species fall out here. And as you can see, 2014 samples late in the year pushed the frontier for the communities that we were seeing in this area. So I'm going to take this plot and flip it, rotate it so that we have the lead axis here on the Y instead of on the X. So you can then see how 2014 compares to the other years. So 2014 are the solid red dots, and this is just a low S filter run through there to kind of highlight the low frequency variability for the different years. You see that 2014 started looking pretty normal, coming into our colder assemblage, but then quickly fell off. The decline started actually in the summer when upwelling began to weaken, and then as that blob came on shore, things went to a very strange space. And in contrast, this was a collapse of what looked normal as opposed to, say, a delayed recovery that we saw in the 2009, after the 2009-10 El Nino. There will be a test on this. I just wanted to point out, these are our common species broken out by the different assemblages that Hoof and Peterson reported and tabulated from the literature. The shifts that we see in that community plot are apparent in the density of common species. A substantial decline or absence of the cold water species and a real shift over to these warm water species. We also, saw a lot of new copepod species. These rare species are not included in the ordination because they're too infrequent to count right now, but we saw quite a few of these warmer water species at THO2. And Roxanne recently brought up to date our entire bongo analysis for euphausids, and in early 2015, she's actually observed a new euphausid for us, Euphausia recurva, which should be further south, including a young of that stage, so they are clearly thriving or doing something up where we are. And to wrap up, going into 2015, we're in our neck of the woods. We had the blob come in, it persisted into December, but then upwelling winds, actually we started to get upwelling winds in January. We start seeing this, a little bit of productivity actually in January, a little storm activity in February, broke this up a little bit, but then again, March, April, we're starting to see a lot of upwelling, a lot of productivity. This bloom, though, unlike a typical spring bloom where we are, is completely dominated by Pseudonychia and actually it's pretty hot for domoic acid. We were fortunate to have a sample analyzed by Clarissa Anderson and Rafe Cadell at UC Santa Cruz, kind of fortuitously, and it's an unusual bloom. The samples came back with this non-diatom green or non-typical diatom green, and turned out to be that. I do want to point out, though, that we are going into this. We got back into our kind of typical TS area where it's cold and relatively salty right near the bottom, but we are still seeing fairly warm surface temperatures, as is evidenced by this picture, where we raise them tough in Humboldt County, but this is ridiculous for April in 2015. And so I believe that's all I have. I do want to, for applause, or maybe to stave off applause, I'm president of the Eastern Pacific Ocean Conference. We're actually going to have a session on the warm blob at our upcoming conference. So if you're on the mailing list, look for that, and hopefully many of you will submit abstracts with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next up is Wendy Enright. She's from the city of San Diego.
Good morning, everyone. Many of you may not know that the City of San Diego conducts a fairly extensive environmental monitoring program. So I'm here on behalf of my co-authors, who are also members of that lab, Adriano Feit, Greg Welch, Amy Latker, and Tim Stebbins, and then also Ed Parnell here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who has been a collaborator for us as we have extended our monitoring beyond our normal work into some moorings, and I will get into that in just a minute. Oop. Here we go. No. Do we have my map? My map isn't here. So what you are not seeing in this slide is a map of the Point Loma region, where the City of San Diego has been conducting CTT gas, bacterial water quality, and in-fauna benthic monitoring since the 1980s, but the present configuration of the outfall has been in place since 1991. Hey, there it is. That's it. That is it. Wow, that's exciting. So, here we are up in La Jolla. The city has a 7-kilometer ocean outfall where it discharges its treated sewage. So as part of its permit to do that, we have these fixed grid of monitoring stations. And these inshore stations in the purple, our kelp stations, have been monitored weekly since 1991. And then these other stations have been monitored monthly up until late 2003, when we had to switch to quarterly sampling. And our stations go from the 9-meter contour in here all the way out to the 100-meter contour. Beginning in mid-2006, and here's where the collaboration with Scripps comes into play, we deployed 2 sets of moored instruments, one here near the active outfall diffuser along the 100-meter contour, and another set here at 60 meters. And these consisted of strings of thermistor temperature loggers, recording temperature about every 4 meters, from about 2 meters off the bottom to within about 6 meters of the surface every 10 minutes. And then we also have current meter data, but I'm not going to get into that just today. Leave you with the tease of that for future work. In the South Bay, there is another ocean outfall discharging treated sewage down here near the US-Mexican border, and we have a very similar setup. We have 3 stations here at the 9 and 18-meter contours that have been monitored weekly since 1995, and then we have a larger series of stations that have been monitored monthly up until about 2013, when we switched to quarterly monitoring. In 2014, we also deployed current meters and temperature loggers here at the end of the outfall. So we don't have any anomaly data, since we don't have a time series for this guy, but we do have some data that I'm going to share with you. So looking at our CTD data, and the CTD package is sort of your standard temperature, salinity, depth, chlorophyll A, fluorescence, pH, and dissolved oxygen, but I'm just showing you temperature today. Here's our beautiful excursion of temperature in the 1998 El Nino event. And here in 2014, unfortunately, you can see how our data gets so sparse at depth when we switch over to quarterly. But in the surface, we can see excursions on the order of the El Nino, not quite as severe, more like 3 degrees. Down in the South Bay, again, slightly shorter time series, and we only go down to 60 meters down there. It's a little shallower area. Nice signal here in the 1998 El Nino. But what we see in the South Bay, down here in the sort of the 30 to 40 meter range, are deviations from the mean of 7 degrees Celsius. So our experience is that in the southern area, we had a much more significant deviation from the mean. Just to switch out from red and blue colors only, we show you some pretty colors. This is our mooring data, beginning in about July 2006, and going up through March of 2015. And there's our warm period, but it just doesn't look as exciting here at the 100-meter mooring as the CTD deviations do. And again, at our 60-meter mooring, we see a very similar pattern. We have some white spaces here where we lost instrumentation or had them trawled up or they otherwise disappeared. If we look at the data just based on the anomalies, 2014 does pop up as our warmest year on record from top to bottom at the 100-meter mooring. And again, here at our 60-meter mooring, we had deviations over 4 degrees Celsius up here in the surface. So this is a teaser. This is brand new data that we just started collecting last year. And I was struck by a talk yesterday that talked about the warm blob arriving within a few hours. And it made me think of this slide where we had 22-degree water at 36 meters, which is very unusual. Nothing like that we've ever seen. And just sort of anecdotally, when we were out on the boat taking our water samples at about this time, we had incredibly clear water. We were at our 18-meter station, and we could clearly see the cobbles on the bottom. It was a very unusual time for us. So have we seen a faunal response? In addition to all this water quality measurements, twice a year we do trawling and we do benthic infaunal grab sampling. And in January of 2015, we did get some visitors of these red tuna crabs. However, they were only on the order of hundreds in a 10-minute, 7.6 meter otter trawl. So it wasn't even on the order of what we saw about 10 years ago or so. But Adriano and Greg were out with Uwe the other week and said they saw thousands and thousands. So we'll be trawling again in July, and it'll be interesting to see if these guys make their presence known to us. So 2015 so far, you can see we only sampled the shallow stations except for quarterly in February when we go all the way to the bottom. Our mooring data showed that March was still incredibly warm. We have not been back out to collect our instruments since March, so I don't have any indication of what those instruments are doing. We'll hope to get out there next month. But at least with our CTD data, we're starting to see signs that April was much more of a neutral, or even there was some weak upwelling going on at that time. So this is definitely an evolving phenomenon, and even in our little tiny sampling area, we are seeing its influence. Oops. And thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Wendy. And next is Sam McClatchy, Southwest Fisheries.
Okay. My co-authors in this work are only a couple of them listed here. There's also Paul Fiedler and Andrew Thompson and Mark Lowry. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really forage rather than sea lions. I'm not an expert in sea lions. Jeff Lake is here, and if you have detailed questions about sea lions, population dynamics, he's the man to talk to. And he has helped me not to embarrass myself with some aspects of that. So I'm going to focus on forage. Most of you have heard about the number of sea lion pups that are washing ashore or coming into the public eye, starving. They're very unwell. The rescue centers are they're overflowing, basically. There have been thousands of pups that have been rescued this year. They're very endearing, but they grow up, as Jeff said the other day, to be rather a problem. They're big animals. They've increased in numbers since 1975, I think, when the Marine Mammal Protection Act was brought in, from 75,000 animals up to about 340,000 animals. The breeding colonies are concentrated in Southern California, also in Baja, but in the Channel Islands. So these animals are close to population centers, and people get upset when they see them starving and looking emaciated. And so they try to rescue them and recover them with sardine smoothies, and then they put them back out in the ocean, and unfortunately the ocean hasn't really changed, and so we don't really know whether all these rescues are helping anything more than how we feel. So I'm going to talk about forage, and of course one of the primary elements of forage is sardine. And what this graph here shows is the temporal series of the biomass estimates of the sardine since the sardine started to recover in the, well, this is actually since 1993. The population started to recover in the late 1980s. And forage fluctuate. They go up and down in a drastic way. And so management essentially is a matter of riding the tiger and trying not to let it get away from you. So in this case, this year, they've actually had to cancel the fishery, an emergency cancellation, because as you can see in 2014 and 2015, the biomass is down to about, I think it's about 95,000 tons. The actual biomass estimate depends partly on the recruitment scenario that they use. The bottom line is that the fishery is at a very low level. It's been declining since about 2006. It's important to bear in mind that sardine are not the only forage fish in the California current ecosystem. The others include jack mackerel, Pacific mackerel, anchovy, smelts, herring, juvenile hake, sand dabs, mesopelagic fish, market squid, and oceanic squid. For most of these species, we do not have assessments. So we don't have biomass estimates per se. Okay, so how might trends in forage affect sea lions? Well, the emaciated pups actually give us a clue. And we use the fishery-independent rockfish recruitment survey, which is run out of the Santa Cruz lab, John Field supervising, to estimate how the trends in forage over time. And what you see here in the map are the stations for the rockfish recruitment survey. The blow-up is for the more southern area that is actually relevant to these California sea lions. The red and the blue lines show the maximum forage ranges for sea lion, female breeding sea lions at the San Miguel colony, that's the red envelope, and the San Nicolas colony, that's the blue envelope. And so we're going to look at the trends in forage for several different areas, including the areas within these foraging envelopes. Before I do that, I want to draw your attention to the table, which basically shows that not all forage are equal. Sardine and anchovy have much higher per gram calorie content and fat content than do rockfish or squid or Pacific hake. So we've got two categories of fish or forage here. We've got fat-rich, calorie-rich forage, sardine and anchovy, and we've got calorie-poor, fat-poor forage, which we looked at squid and rockfish. Okay, so here are the trends in those two groups of forage. The blue and the purple show the trends in the fat-poor forage, that is the market squid and the rockfish. The orange and the red show the trends in the sardine and the anchovy. The three different groups reflect a northern group, Point Reyes to Monterey. You can see on this map, basically north of Monterey up to San Francisco. San Diego to Monterey, so Monterey south to San Diego, all along the coast. And then the San Miguel Range, which is the red envelope in this map. In all three cases, the fat-poor and calorie-poor forage are increasing. That's the sardine, anchovy. I beg your pardon, the rockfish and the squid, and the sardine and anchovy are declining. So based on this, we set up a hypothesis that we should be able to predict the temporal sequence of the pup weights based on these two forage variables. The two forage variables are sardine plus anchovy, relative abundances from the trawls and the rockfish recruitment. The second variable is rockfish plus squid, and we included an interaction term between these two. This graphic is really the take-home point. This shows the temporal trend in the pup weights over time for the period at which we had concurrent sampling from the rockfish recruitment survey within the foraging range of the sea lions, and also we had published pup weight data for the California sea lions. So we predicted pup weight from these two derived variables, you can see here, sardine, anchovy, and squid and rockfish, and their interaction. Because the slopes are different for male and female, we had a categorical variable for squid. When you look at this, you can see that the actual observed values here, which are the solid, the dark lines for males and females, are very close to the predicted values that I obtained from the model. And the dotted lines are the prediction limits for this generalized linear model that I used to predict pup weight as a function of the forage variables. Now, as you know, whenever you fit a model to data, if you refit the model to the data again, you may not get exactly the same model. And so what we did was we used model averaging to create these model curves here, and we took the three best models that were within 7 AICC units of the best model, and we averaged them to get the coefficients that were then used to generate the predictions, which are the pink and blue for the males and the females and the males in this graph. So how do we compare whether these predictions are reasonable? Is there an agreement between the model and the predictions? Well, for a GLM, one simple way of determining this is just to look at the straight correlation between the two. And the correlation between the observations and the modeled variables in this graph is 0.94 for the females and 0.95 for the males. The other point that I'd like to make for this, and I haven't actually presented the coefficients, is that when you have an interaction term in a model like this, the surface is actually quite complicated, and so you can't interpret the main effects in the simple way that you would normally interpret it if there were no interaction terms. And actually, the interaction terms are really important. If you use the AICC weights to look at the relative importance of the main effects and the interactions, you see that the squid and the rockfish and the interaction term were much more important than the sardine and anchovy in the model. So the media is saying, well, the sardine are not around, the sardine have gone down, the sardine are far offshore. That is what's causing the sea lions. Actually, it's probably more like the shift to the fat-poor forage, the rockfish and the squid, that's causing it rather than the disappearance of the sardine. Of course, the suspicion is always that the fishery has caused the collapse has caused the stress on the predators. And we're working on another paper where we basically, Russ Vetter and I are working on another paper where we've quantified the consumption from the predators, all of the marine mammals. We may get together with Bill Seidemann and look at the consumption of the birds as well, and compared that to the fishery. If you just look at the mammals, then the consumption by the fishery is about 1/5 of the consumption by the mammals. So if you want to know where the sardine went, it might pay to talk to the sea lions. Their conclusions are, of Central and Southern California, some forage are increasing, market squid and rockfish, while others are decreasing or at very low levels. That's the sardine and anchovy. The change in the relative species composition of the forage produced a trend of declining food quality in the last decade, as measured by calorie and fat content. This trend alone can be used to predict the temporal pattern of emaciation in the California sea lion pups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And next we have Tenaya. She's from the Marine Mammal Center.
Okay, so Sam, that was a great talk, and all of them have been great. So I guess I'll wait.
Let me just switch things.
Is it not showing?
I'm just trying to get it.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the stranded pinnipeds and some anomalies we've seen in that group of animals. So these are animals that are not on rookeries, not in their normal places, and are mostly on the mainland. I'm from the Marine Mammal Center, and this graph shows the total numbers of seals and sea lions that we've seen at the Marine Mammal Center through our history, and hopefully you can see that 2014 and especially 2015 have been very different in terms of the number of animals we've seen for the year and the timing of when we're seeing these animals. So the Marine Mammal Center is a nonprofit that is authorized by NIMS to respond to live stranded marine mammals between Mendocino and San Luis Obispo County. In August 2013, our range expanded to include Santa Barbara County. Our main hospital is just north of the Golden Gate Bridge in Sausalito, California, and we have 2 triage facilities to the south in Monterey and Morro Bays because most of our sea lions are stranding south of San Francisco. So we respond to 6 species of pinnipeds shown here, all very cute, but I'm partial to the harbor seals. And I'm going to talk about the California sea lion and the Guadalupe fur seal today. So the California sea lion is shown in black on this map, and the Guadalupe fur seal is grouped with the other in green, which are a small proportion of our total numbers. So the California sea lions are what we see the most of at the Marine Mammal Center and explain most of the variability that we see among years. And the gray dashed line that you see from 1997 to 2013 is the mean number per year, our annual number. And you can see that in 2014 we exceeded this number, not by much, when you just look at our historic stranding range, so Mendocino to San Luis Obispo County. I made all the graphs just the historic, so it's comparing a little bit more apples to apples. But I did throw up our total numbers for our entire response range in the last 2 years in this bottom table. And you can see that in the first 4 months of 2015, we've already responded to more pinnipeds than we normally see in an entire calendar year. And we've probably broken 1,200 at this point. They're coming in large batches every day, which, no surprise. So Sam just told you about this. They breed in the Channel Islands. There's over 300,000. This bottom picture is of a quite fat, and Jeff Lake will be happy, branded, or maybe not, adult female. And these guys are year-round residents south of San Francisco. And the adult males move to the north during the non-breeding season. So just a quick summary of their annual cycle. So most pups are born in June. Hopefully in good years, they nurse for at least 10 months and are weaned around like April and May. And what I want you to take away from the top part of this slide is that adult females are often pregnant while they're nursing a pup. So there's huge energetic demands on these moms, especially in the spring months when they're in their 3rd trimester and they have probably depleted a lot of their body stores. And the moms take 2 to 4 day foraging trips out to sea and are on land like 1 to 2 days with their pups nursing them. So during the 10 months, that's kind of their cycle. So this is a really simplistic view of causes of stranding for the animals that we see, the sea lions that we see. In green, I have grouped together animals that are less than 2 years old. And these animals, so they wean at about a year old. And so less than 2 years old, these are kind of newly weaned animals that are still figuring out how to find food on their own. And most of the time when we see them at the Marine Mammal Center, they're suffering from malnutrition and just this failure to find enough food out in the wild to thrive. The blue shaded bars are older animals that have survived for at least a year on their own without mom's help. And so they usually strand for reasons other than malnutrition. It's usually infectious disease or domoic acid toxicosis. And you can see that most of the interannual variability is these young animals, so the green bars, and coming in during warm years. So El Niños jump out. There's a lot of talk in the marine mammal community along the West Coast about the importance of El Niños. So I would love to have discussions about El Niño versus warm water and when is it really El Niño, because that gets so much importance put on it, but I don't know if it's the top. And then for the older animals, a lot of the adult females come in with domoic acid toxicosis, and so they have people love hearing about when we have domoic acid affected females, because then they can kind of up their sampling and go out in areas where we're getting lots of stranded animals. In 2014, we had a lot of adult females that were stranding, and then the younger age classes, but in 2015 so far, it's mostly been the young guys that are just starving. I did a necropsy on a pup last week that was 9 kilograms. That's birth weight. It's almost a year old, and it's as small as it was when it was born. So this is a figure of sea lions that are less than 2 years old, and just for the Mendocino to San Luis Obispo area of our range. And number of strandings per month, so this is the best I could do for a squiggly line for you guys. And you can see that in most years, and historically, we get this age class in the summer months. So May through July is usually our peak. And that peak is higher in years where there's warm waters, which I highlighted in these colored years, a couple of warm years. And then since 2013, we've had this shift to seeing younger animals earlier in the year. In 2013, there's 59% of the total sea lions that were less than a year old stranded before May 1st. 2014, this was 48%. In 2015, we'll wait to see. I try to tell all my colleagues at the center that we've never had a year where we've had like a bimodal. So hopefully this is on the decline, but they are a pretty superstitious group, the vets that I work with, and they think I've jinxed us all. We're going to see something similar to 2009. It's just out there. So Guadalupe fur seals, I just wanted to briefly touch on them. They breed primarily on Guadalupe Island, which is off of Baja, California. And usually we don't see very many of these animals, 0 to 5 every year since our records began in 1975. This year we've had, I think it's now 16 of these guys. Their population, just like the sea lions, is shown in this bottom graph, but they're increasing, so there's more out there. But this is a dramatic increase from one year to the next, and from, pretty flat line. So just to wrap that up, so we've had an increased number of stranded pinnipeds in California beaches in 2014 and the spring of 2015. This is similar to other years in which we've had anomalously warm waters off our coast. And it seems to primarily affect the young animals, which makes sense. They are inexperienced foragers. And so what's been different about the past 2 years is that the peak in sea lion strandings for the young animals has shifted from the spring to the summer months. And so this suggests that the lactating females are unable to adequately provision their pups. So whether they're finding prey that's of lesser quality, or whether there's greater depletion or just changes, this year is different than in what we're seeing in the sea lions than any other year we've seen. We've had a record number of Guadalupe fur seals this year. And so somebody talked yesterday about sea surface temperature being the winner, and sea lions and these otariids are definitely losers in this equation. So we all know that marine mammals are an integral component of marine ecosystems. They're sentinel species. People really care about skinny sea lion pups on the beach and marine mammals in general. But there's no readily accessible or easy way to get marine mammal health data currently. So I just have access to Marine Mammal Center data because that's the group that I work with. But there's stranding organizations up and down the coast in all of your guys' region that are collecting similar data and have maybe the same or different sentinel species. And so we started this project about a year and a half ago called Marine Mammal Health Map. And the idea is to collate this marine mammal health and stranding data into this centralized database, a national database, which will hopefully become global at some point. That's compatible for integration with the environmental data sets and accessible to everyone through IUCE. And so last year, we put together a little pilot project so that when we talked about the Marine Mammal Health Map, especially when we're trying to go and get funding, we could have a demo to say this is what we mean. And so this is an example of it. It's non-operational, so you need this link to go and interact with the data. And it's just a small time period from a couple of different stranding network partners. So by no means like start using these data, but we think it's pretty cool to be able to look at it in a way that's regional, national, and then also integrated with the environmental data. So that's all I have.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Hello. Yeah. All right. So we are very fortunate to have Armando Castro here today. He is from Sisese down in Ensenada.
Thank you. Hi. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to mention my collaborators in this work. They are Eduardo Gonzalez and Ramos. Those are the guys that are really doing most of the job. I'm just putting it together. They handle very well all the databases that you've mentioned here. And I'm using some of them to look at the, what's it called? The junior blob, or the whatever happened in southern Baja California. So I titled this talk, The Warm Winter of 2014, in the entrance to the Gulf of California. You see, I like my winters cold, and this one wasn't. So I'll show you. First of all, we will be using databases from the climatological stations at several places in the peninsula, in the southern half, from the one in the north, here in the town of Guerrero Negro, where people go to watch whales, and down to Cabo. There's a small detail here of all the stations that we will be using to show the effect on the air temperature. And we will also be using modest sea surface temperatures for this area, and air pressure, the difference between Puerto Peñasco up north and La Paz from automatic weather stations. These are the air temperatures. This is 2014, maximum temperature for January only. And this is 2013. We had extremely warm January. This was The top was Ciudad Constitución, where it's a town in the middle of the peninsula. It's far from both coasts, and it's I suppose it's not, the ocean is not helping to regulate temperatures. So the maximum was 5 degrees higher in January, so it was really warm. La Paz, what is it? 7. It was, the maximum was also several degrees higher. The mean for the whole month of January was several degrees higher. So minimum temperatures that are okay. Only the very far south and far north, like Guerrero Negro in the north and Cabo in the south, they didn't show much differences, but the rest of the peninsula was very warm, and I wasn't happy with it. As I said, I like my winters wintry. This is the mean of monthly sea surface temperature for this whole area. So it's both a time mean and a spatial mean. And we only subtracted the yearly harmonic. So you see, from 2003 to the present, this is to March 2014, you see that something similar to what, I can't remember the name, sorry, somebody was looking at this same data set with a microwave sea surface temperatures, something very similar. It was a high oscillations here, an area relatively, at the time, relatively quiet, and then an increase in the amplitude of the oscillations by this time. So what we are looking at is extreme, the warmest sea surface temperatures in over 11 years of records. That one, okay? Now, we can also look at other variables. This area is controlled by what the meteorologists called, I hope I get this right, the North American monsoon. So in the winter, if we take the difference between pressure in the north and in the south of the Gulf of California, we get positive values, and in the summer, mostly negative. So this changes, and then again in the winter. For the winter of 2014, we had 3 extreme events. This coincide with, if you look at the low pass of the wind at La Paz only, this is the best record I could get, you get northerly events. Winds from along the axis of the Gulf from the northwest, very important for primary productivity. So we had 3 big ones in January and February and March in 2013, and almost nothing during 2014. Only one at the end of the season, 16 April. It was very strong, very short. Anyway, so the winds were abnormal. What was the effect on the sea surface temperatures in more detail? We already saw that there was a warming, but how does it actually look like? This is January mean for the whole month of January in 2013, February and March. This is 2014. You see how the 25-degree isotherm is much further north, and it's beginning to form like a warm water tongue advancing on the west side of the entrance. This is what actually happens in the month of May, June, July. This is normal, but not for the month of March. Anomalies are higher in March and higher about 4 to 5 degrees in the southern Gulf of California, but you can also see it in the entrance. So just north of the Marias Island here. Also, something going on here where there should be some effect of the California current. Apparently, is not getting there. Anyway, but the more important impact was on primary productivity from chlorophyll. This is from MODIS again, high level, high resolution, 1 kilometer imagery, averaged for the months of January, February, and March 2013, and then 2014, and the anomalies. So you see, in January 2013, we had normal high, very high productivity by the month of March, which is what one expects, and the opposite tendency in 2014. Instead of having the maximum, we had the least productive month was March. And the anomalies also to let you know what the differences are. Sometimes up to 4. These are, what are the units? I can't remember. 4 in units of chlorophyll. So it was a very dramatic impact. So I'm telling the story backwards. I haven't talked about the large-scale databases, but let's see what is happening with the PDO and the, it says May, but this is the multivariate ENSO index, right? Yeah. So this is from 1990 to the present, the behavior of these two indexes was, if we only look at the 2014, at the end of 2014 and 15, they were both negative. They only became positive when the anomaly was already there. So they are not telling us much. But if we, now looking at the blob, then we have January 2013, February and March 2014, and now look at January 2014. Several people have shown this. These are sea surface temperatures. I also plotted the pressure, but I don't think it's so relevant anymore. And then you can see that at the entrance of the Gulf of California, the pressure, the sea surface temperature was already high, totally independent of what was going on the Pacific Northwest. And by the month of March, we had a very intense anomaly up to probably 1.5 to 2 degrees. And that is what I call the mini anomaly, as opposed to the mega anomaly over here, or the blob. So this tells to me that the blob or the anomaly in the entrance to the Gulf of California is perhaps linked to the other one, to the big one, by some kind of atmospheric teleconnection. It's probably something that could be found out with models. I have several conclusions. First, we did have the warmer winter in 2014, warmer in the ocean in the last more years. The entrance experienced the relaxation of wind forcing, significant sea surface warming, and very low chlorophyll concentrations. They tend to increase from January to March. The opposite tendency was there in chlorophyll. This had only been reported in the past during ENSO events. This is not an ENSO event, nothing to do with it. The relaxation of the wind appears directly related, I don't know, appears to be the case, to the observed warming and productivity deficit consistent with an atmospheric teleconnection. Main ocean processes involve a weaker coastal upwelling, of course, a deficit in southward advection of cooler waters within the Gulf, and or perhaps a deficit in entrance of cooler water from the California current as well, and a smaller heat loss to the atmosphere due to weaker winds. That's it.
Thank you very much, Armando. All right, so now it would be great to have all of the speakers from the Southwest. So that means those that were also talked yesterday, because we didn't get a discussion time after your presentation. So Dan Rudnick is going to moderate this. And everyone, just come on up front and let's ask some questions.
All right. So we got the firing squad ready to go now. And the floor is open to questions. Everybody's up here. So does anybody up in the front have a question for anybody else? There we go. Jim.
Should I wait for the microphone?
Okay, I'm going to address this question to Tanya. Did I get that right? Yes. So, no. You. So, is there any evidence? I was noted when I was listening to Bill Seideman's talk yesterday about the birds. You know, it came apparent that birds are real smart and they won't reproduce when food conditions are real bad. And is there any evidence that with pinnipeds that things ever get so bad that they don't reproduce? I'm sorry, wrong person. So, the pinniped person. So.
Yeah. So, is this on? Hello.
The suspense is killing me now.
Testing.
There it is. Yeah.
So Jeff Lake in the back of the room is probably better able to answer this, but my understanding is that in a normal year, 75% of the females breed, and that can be as low as 40% in these warm years like El Niños. So they do make a decision to either not breed, not carry a pup, or they wean their pups early. And I don't know, Jeff, I don't know if you know, he keeps waving me off. If they choose one or the other, they either abandon their pup first or they abort their pregnancy first. Like, I don't know what they would do first. Does that answer?
What was going on in 2009?
For the sea lions again? So that was a year that had anomalous warm waters, but it was like a shutdown of upwelling. I'm sure there's other people that can talk more about what was going on in the ocean. But those were all pups that had weaned at a year old, and so they were either, you know, just under a year or just over a year that weren't finding food out there. So it's not a failure on the mother's part, it's the pups that, you know, just can't find any food because they're inexperienced foragers. So this year is different from that because this is the moms. The moms should be able to find food. They have a history of success out in the wild. They've made it. They don't start breeding until, you know, like age 5. So they've made it 5 years, able to support themselves and hopefully had pups. So 2009, different things going on. And we think with sea lions, the timing, the intensity, and the duration of these events are really important. So those are things when we're talking about what's going on in the ocean that are important to kind of these top predators. It's when does it occur in relation to these important life events?
If it's all right, I'll address some of those comments. Mammals were born to reproduce. They don't decide not to reproduce. They always want to reproduce, and it's a failure basically. So another thing that she didn't explain is they're delayed implanters. So they breed in July. They don't actually implant the fetus until October, November, in that period of time. So if they're nutritionally stressed during that time, it just won't implant. And then the other thing that goes on, and we're seeing it down here in La Jolla, is they'll prematurely abort. So I always hate to anthropomorphize animals, right? They're not making a decision. Their body just can't do it, okay? And so we're seeing premature abortions up there, premature pupping out on the islands. 2009 was actually the most negative upwelling index we've ever had. It happened right in May and June. And I remember I was on a conversation with oceanographers. Don't boo me after this. But I could, man, this looks like an El Nino. This looks like an El Nino. We're having mortality out on the islands, just something fierce. I mean, it was huge. And people didn't see it here because they didn't make it, because it was May and June, right, when their pups are being born. So they were just dying like crazy out there. He said, oh, no, it's not an El Nino. It's not an El Nino. 5 months later, oh, that was an El Nino. So whether it was an El Nino or not, we were seeing the sea lions are very, very sensitive to what goes on in terms of temperature in the ocean for the reasons she explained.
Yeah, so at the other end of the food web, in the chlorophyll estimates that would derive from ocean color, I'm just interesting this is, that was shown by several folks, and for anyone who wants to chime in on, I'm interested in were the algorithms used for that coastal algorithms that take into account turbidity or not, and particularly the ones that were done further north along the coast where that's probably more of an issue.
Is Mari Karu here? My co-author, Mari Karu, who doesn't seem to be in the room, is the best qualified to answer that question.
Anybody else want to follow up now?
Actually, I have a question for Sam. Congratulations on your model doing so well in showing sea lion emaciation, but it only go to 2011. How is it done in the last couple of years, and specifically how is it done in coping with the changes we've seen in the last year?
I don't know, and the reason I don't know is that the data are not available to us. There are certain data sets within NOAA which are not yet public for various reasons, some of them good, some of them not so good. And I was not able to access all of the more recent data. Looking back in time, the reason that I didn't use the already published earlier data than 2004 is that the Rockfish Recruitment Survey only covers the areas south of Monterey since 2004. So we had problems at both ends of the time series. However, by Christmas, all NOAA data is going to be public by presidential directive. So my problem would have gone away, but unfortunately, I'm a little bit early.
I guess I'm going to put John on the spot here. And in particular, with the kind of the precedent for this, the kind of recent happenings and that sort of thing, and with all due respect, one period that has come up in discussions with folks is the 1957-58 was a very unusual time both in the tropical Pacific and in the Northeast Pacific. And if you happen to have any sort of insights you could provide in terms of giving us kind of a historical context for what we're seeing.
Wait, did you say 5.7 and 5.8?
Yeah, 57,
oh, yeah,
58.
Yes, that was a very important year, a big El Nino year, and we do have time series that go back that far. So
but
it was the actual genesis of the whole concept of El Ninos.
Well, right. But I guess my question, or just kind of comment for anybody who could comment on that, is to the extent that we saw along the West Coast similar effects to what we're seeing this time.
Well, we haven't all of the same measurements. Our time series of temperature and salinity along the West Coast go back to the 1920s. So we can say quite a bit about temperature, salinity, and density. Our chlorophyll measurements only started in about 1983 at Scripps, and not until 2006 for the rest of the coast. And to answer your question about whether it was satellite derived, the answer is no. Those are all direct measurements of using a fluorometer and extracted, filtered chlorophylls. Does that satisfy you?
Yeah, Mark has got the edge, it looks like.
Just a brief comment. The Kalkofe data also go back to 57, 58, and we will look at those historical data and compare them with the 98 El Nino and this recent event. We haven't done it yet.
My reading is the evidence from the 57, 58, 59 event was very different than what we've seen in 2014, 2015. For one, there was rather clearly anomalously weak southward advection. Bernal et al. Showed us that. There were dramatic declines in more northerly temperate latitude zooplankton species and marked increases in subtropical zooplankton species. We did not see that in spring 2014. We've not yet enumerated the samples for 2015, so the jury's still out there. But the signal from 57, 58 was very clearly propagating from south to north. There was a transport of unusual zooplankton fauna. The pelagic red crabs that Wendy Enright alluded to were transported from their main breeding centers off Baja California, off the Shelf Slope region, into this area, progressively further and further north into the California current. I think they extended as far as Oregon. There was a very clearly strong advective component there.
Just that I'm getting confused as a non-biologist, because sometimes I've heard over the past months that there was an unusual abundance of warm water tropical, I guess, fish species in this region. But now you are telling us that, I guess that's zooplankton or something you're talking about, that last year, 2014, there were no warmer or temperate latitude species found here. And can somebody explain that to me? Which are those the higher trophic levels where the warm species were found here and the lower trophic levels not? Or is that a contradiction, or is it not? Or am I just confused?
Okay, I don't think it's necessarily a contradiction. I mean, the plankton are more carried with the water masses, and some of the fish, certainly the larger fish, can swim. And they do. They don't just get carried by the currents. So the fact that you might have differences in game fish at the sports tournaments isn't really inconsistent with not finding differences in the zooplankton community composition.
Well, I think you saw right.
Sam is exactly right. One other qualification I want to reinforce is that we have detailed taxonomic enumerations of the zooplankton from this area for springtime cruises. There are 4 Calcoffee cruises per year. We don't have the financial resources to analyze the samples at other times of year. So we have a good interannual picture on variations in springtime abundance, but we cannot resolve the within-year variations. So those are the limits of the data that we have. We have fantastic samples, and if someone would like to help us help support the effort, we can do a great deal more with them.
So I would like to ask a question of the group, and that is, I'll make the point that often around here, almost always, the biggest climate variability we feel is from the south, from El Nino, and we've just discussed one of those events. And it seems that one of the things that makes this year different is it doesn't seem to be completely driven from the south, as is often the case. And I just was wondering if anybody would care to comment on the relative effects of from the north and south this year that might make it unique.
Can I say something? The effect of the warming at the entrance of the Gulf of California was before all of the other effect. I mean, it was in January 2014. It was much earlier, much before the El Nino and much before the other, the blob arrived to the coast at the other places. So everybody says July, September 2014. It was in the south, it was earlier. But El Nino wasn't happening at the time. The equator was normal at this time. So it's not related.
The spring Calcoffee cruise just came back about 10 days ago, and they make ready a product on the web, which is the spatial fields, preliminary spatial fields of temperature and other variables. I was really struck from the spring cruise by the temperature spatial field at 100 meters, which shows a beautiful intrusion of what looks to me like an intrusion of warm water from the south, and also an intrusion of warm water from the northwest. It's really remarkable. It looks like there are two influences, which probably then, on entering the area of Southern California, get mixed and muddied with the very complex hydrography in that region.
Can I make a comment from the floor here?
Of course.
So the salinity field doesn't seem to suggest that there's much movement north and south, which is consistent, I think, with the fact that perhaps, at least in Southern California, you didn't see the warm southern species. In the cruise that we made down to Baja in February, if there was a salinity signature, it was towards freshening water at depth. So, if anything, more water from the north, which again would be inconsistent with with something from the south. But Eric, you showed what seemed to be like a shift in your copepod communities up north of the warmer. Could that be offshore water coming in, or is that definitely a north-south phenomenon?
That's a good question. Some of those species, if you look at the latitudinal range, if you go out towards Japan further, they get quite a ways north. So it could just be oceanic water coming in. But some of them are also warm water coastal species, or at least that's my understanding from the literature, that are coastal species. So there may have been some advection from the south that we would see in normal wintertime conditions. This was also happening, as you pointed out. We had some winter storms. We had some downwelling events that actually began kind of early in the fall that may have driven a little bit of that, but not in terms, I would think more in terms of the downwelling event kind of transport, rather than some sustained northward transport. But I haven't looked at any of the current fields or anything like that to be able to say for sure. The Euphausia recurva was pretty unusual, though, because that, I think, is more southern. So,
I'm sorry Nate Mantua is not here, because he and I have been having a discussion, and he feels very strongly we shouldn't be calling this an El Nino. And so having that, and Nick, you should probably be answering this, but it's really interesting. Andy Lysing was just showing me, he did a comparison of the 98 El Nino conditions versus what's going on this year, and you can see that they're not the same thing. So what we're seeing is very different. We shouldn't be calling it an El Nino. We should be, I don't know what we're going to call it, but it's more like a large-scale PDO or something like that. So I think we should be real careful about the terminology we use.
I've got a question. Sorry, I'm at the back. For anyone that's that's familiar with the cow coffee, or Catherine with the glider data, have you looked at timing or the formation of the California undercurrent, and if that's changed at all during this time period?
Yeah, there's nothing strikingly anomalous in the velocity fields at all, be it southward advection or northward advection. So yeah, we're investigating, but it doesn't appear to be stronger or weaker.
Can we come back to Toby's point and Dan's question? Because I think this is a central question. I actually hear a discrepancy. I've heard a discrepancy between Uwe and co-authors' interpretations yesterday that had to do with coastally trapped waves and their signature at the nearshore mooring off Point Conception. And Armando's result that in the mouth of the Gulf of California, the anomalies arrived before there could have been any propagation from the equator. So before Toby rules out the evidence of El Nino at all, I'm wondering, could there be a difference in timing where the initiation of the event was propagating mainly from the north, whether that's through the atmosphere or the ocean? It's not entirely clear to me. But then after those conditions are set up, that there is the influence that's coming from the equator via coastally trapped waves. And perhaps you could speak, Uwe, to whether the coastally trapped waves, you're linking that to events along the equator or not.
It also struck me, this analysis from CSS and the Gulf of California, both the timing and observation that the warming there seemed to be related to the relaxation of the winds. So I think it would be useful to kind of sit down and look at the timing in more detail of the relaxation of the winds they saw versus the anomalies that we saw propagating up from the equator and so on. And I suppose, like in many cases, it's well possible that it's a mix or succession of different things. And if it was just a propagating wave, then it would be like an El Nino, and we always hear it doesn't look like an El Nino. There must be something else that means. So, and I guess we'll have to sit down and compare our data sets and try to figure out which came first and which is dominant. And we also have some contradictory data sets that we still have to work out, whether the winds were weaker or stronger, and where. I guess it's a matter of location, where you look and which data set you look at. And also this question of advection. So in some places there seems to be more northward advection, but I hear more and more evidence that there is maybe not much anomalous northward advection. So we have to resolve these discrepancies, I think.
I have a question about this. My understanding, and I'm not a physical oceanographer, was that coastally trapped waves can be remotely forced along the coast of Baja and affect the temperatures at Scripps Pier. And the waves don't necessarily have to originate by propagation across the Pacific and then up the continental coast. Is that not the case?
Yeah, and we over the last year in my group, and Sung Young, who is not here now, he has worked a lot on that. He has developed some kind of correlation empirical methods to add up all the wind forcing to the south, all the way to the southern tip of Baja, with lagged with the phase speed of a coastally trapped wave to sum up the effect of the forcing that comes from the south. And that's why he had looked at wind anomalies all the way to the south. And at least when you apply a filter over the season, it doesn't seem to be more anomalous than some other years. But there may be events that cause something. And one thing that caught my attention was what Francisco pointed out yesterday, that even though, at least in Monterey, the average wind forcing didn't seem to be atypical, the variability was maybe different from other years. So it may have also something to do with a more some rectification or sequence of upwelling, forcing, and relaxation that's different. And so maybe it's not good enough to just look at the kind of seasonally filtered winds. Maybe we have to look more at events, and it's a bit more work to do that all the way up and down the coast.
Hello.
May I just one other point? And I think Nick's paper talked about that it is driven by the tropics. I don't think that's really in dispute, but it's not the traditional El Nino signal. And I think Dan's glider data on line 90 really shows that, in that from 2006-07, his SoCal Nino tracks with El Nino until 2014 or 13. And then suddenly we see this divergence. So I still think it's being driven by the tropics, but I don't think we should be saying it's a definite El Nino type signal.
Just a comment. I'm an ecotoxicologist about the marine mammals, and we know that the pollution, the chemical pollution in the oceans, is increasing every year. So just want to add a comment that we should include data like chemical analysis and chemical pollutions, mainly the POPs. They are the persistent organic pollutants in this data, because, for example, in marine mammals, we know the effects of that. In California, there are the highest levels of DDT and DDEs in the world, and they are endocrine disruptors. So they have an effect in rats that the females stop to taking care of the calves. So maybe this can happen also in the pinnipeds here, but of course we need more data and more studies to be sure that this is happening. But can be one of the causes and also all the emerging chemicals they are throwing the water every day, the pharmaceuticals, the sunscreens, the pesticides. So we need to include this kind of data just to compare with oceanographic, physical, and biological data. We need chemical just to compare with these situations to see if it's have an influence in the decreasing of the populations. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take us back to the indicators of the water advection. Just as a comment from the biological indicators off of Oregon and Northern California, did anybody see Nyctiphini simplex in any of the samples? Because that's the strongest indicator that I know of that it had to be a near shore northward advection as opposed to offshore to onshore. Recurva can come from offshore very far, but Nyctiphini simplex we've seen in every previous large El Nino.
So, like I said, Roxanne just completed our analysis. We have observations of Nyctiphanes in our time series, but not this year. We haven't seen them yet. We'll go back and make sure we haven't missed them. It's one of those rare species where we get up there. I think we've seen it twice before, back towards the beginning of the time series. So it's rare where we are. And I guess I'm stuck.
Comment on the if it's an El Nino or not, and my only comment on that is that it's not over yet. And if you look at the tropical forcing right now, it looks like we're heading into something that really does look like an El Nino. And is it related to what has happened over the last couple of years or not? In 2 or 3 years, we'll probably know a little better.
This week's Climate Prediction Center report says we're 70% chance to stay in an El Nino through the fall. So.
Yeah, I also wanted to make a comment about this discussion about El Nino and the effects. I think this is actually one of the most important discussions that we've had so far. And I think what we've seen, if we think about the biological observations, we've seen a lot of regional variability in things, and there are different mechanisms that are supporting that variability. And I happen to believe that there was a Kelvin wave early in 2014. So whether you call it an El Nino or not, there were El Nino signals. So I believe what Uwe was talking about yesterday, and that something happened coastally. It may not have extended much further than Point Conception, but something did come up from the south. And then also we know that we've got influences from the north. So I think that rather than sort of arguing whether or not it was or wasn't El Nino, that, yeah, that's not my mic, somebody over there, that it's probably more fruitful for us to think about, what are these different mechanisms, when did they occur, and just accept the fact that there were a lot of different things going on simultaneously, and it was Blob and Blob Jr. and El Nilnita. So I'm sorry it's complex, but that's the deal.
I guess I'll make my comment. So I think we've all hit on timing's really important, and so and I know, kind of being an outsider in this community, this is the most oceanographers I've been around at one time. I know in the marine mammal community and the groups that I am normally talking to, when people hear El Nino, they don't make the connection between there's something happening at the equator and it takes time to move up the coast. They'll attribute everything that's happening like right here, right now, to that El Nino. And so it's like warm water associated with the blob that's off of Alaska and the North Pacific, and warm water at the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of California. They hear El Nino and all those warm water things kind of get linked to it. So like timing and when these things move up the coast is really important to talk about.
I have a comment to follow up on the idea that pollution may be important to the condition of the sea lions. It's not, at least in the modeling that I did, the purpose was to take an information theoretic approach and basically have a hypothesis as to what might be going on, and then to formulate the simplest possible model and to test whether it had predictive power. Now, we could have thrown in many other variables, and there's always a temptation to do that and to look at which variables fall out from the modeling, but essentially, unless you really have a hypothesis that's driving your modeling, that is a data dredging approach, which is probably should be discouraged. So I'm not at all sure whether pollution might have had an effect. It might well, and one could certainly test that. But I just wanted to state that we deliberately didn't test all possible variables.
I just had one question to Francisco. I'm sure you are in kind of tune with what's happening off Peru. Can you tell us what happened off the coast of Peru when this anomaly that clearly propagated along the equator hit the coast, and then we all see something came up our coast? Was there a physical, or more interestingly, some ecosystem impact that looked like an El Nino or something off Peru?
Not much, and I don't think actually that many of us have seen the effect of the propagating wave. So I always tend to disagree with my colleague Seidman. I don't think there's any evidence of any strong propagating waves associated with the April Kelvin wave. And off Peru, it did what it had been doing previously. It kind of died. Right. But the same is not true about what's happening right now. So the ecosystem was actually, the anchovy had been in decline for the last few years, and so 2014 was not a very good year for the anchovy. So it's a kind of a mixed response that I'm giving you here. But in terms of temperature and signatures, it didn't seem to have a big effect.
Yeah, I have a general question, actually, not only for the people up at the front, but for anyone in the room. And I have yet to hear any of the research that has been explained in the last couple of days that has called upon the Argo data set, which is these free-floating floats out in the Pacific. And I guess the general question is, has anybody accessed this data or interpreted it or used it to try and explain what's going on a large scale? Nick?
Yeah, well, I can answer that. Surely the answer is yes. We did invite a few of the folks in the Argo community to this meeting. Unfortunately, they have a meeting exactly now, too. So I know for a fact that people are looking at this using Argo data. I don't know exactly.
It's not this one. This one is
I did it.
There we go. Thank you. It's that one. I think it's that one. Anyways, there are people looking at this, at these phenomena right now with Argo data. There's probably quite a few, and we invited the ones we knew of, but unfortunately they had an Argo meeting right now.
But the time series is short too, right? The time series of the Argo data is short.
They're not that short. I think the primary problem is that the Argo floats are not really close to the coast where we make our, where we ask our questions. In the offshore area, of course, they're good, but in the inshore areas, they just are not present.
Right, I could say that in the work that we did, we used the Argo data both directly and indirectly. The ocean analysis that our kind of heat budgets were based on, GODAS, assimilates the Argo data. And then we also, Howard Freeland directly used the Argo measurements collapsed onto the P line to look at how the temperatures there varied with respect to the historical record, about 10 or 15 years that they had good ones there. So in answer, that subsurface information has been included in at least the open ocean part of the analysis.
Yeah, just want to add to the point. Most of the data presented in the last 2 days, either near the coast or along certain lines, either Kakaafi or the glider lines. If you go away from those locations, Argo data is probably the only source of information allow you to document this kind of long-term variability. For our study, we use Argo data both for assimilation into our model and also comparing vertical structure. When you look at the vertical penetration beyond those glider line, Argo data is the key.
So I had a question of a different kind, maybe for Toby, about public education. You know, I think what we're seeing is that there are multiple processes at work here producing these signals. You know, like back in 82, 83, the public learned about El Nino as the single thing that happens. Is this an opportunity to educate the public more in terms of the complexity of our ocean and its ecosystems?
I think absolutely. I think we have to take advantage of every disaster we can to educate the public. No, I'm serious. I think it's a great opportunity because it's not only the short-term thing, but also it extends out into climate. So I think if we're not making a real effort to educate the public on this, we're not doing our jobs.
All right. Are there any further? Oh, yeah.
I have a question for Ted. I mean, you looked at the altimetry data during the 1997, 1998 El Nino, and have you seen the same thing for this year?
Yeah, no, I had the same question for myself listening here. So no, I haven't been looking at it. I've been looking off of Argentina, you know, with Yi Chao and other people. So maybe I'll look back at the California current.
It would be nice to do that because I remember even with Aviso, we could look at the train of coastally trapped waves for that particular event. So maybe it's a good idea to do that now.
Well, if you look at the Aviso, we did a quick analysis of Aviso. You'll surely see these blobs. We do a phase correlation. You see even the propagation from offshore to inshore. So Aviso from the altimetry certainly provide quite a bit of information in addition to SST, for example.
All right. I think I'm being told that we have to finish up. So thank you very much. All our speakers.